Before we begin tonight's journey, I want to gently ask one small thing. If you truly enjoy these calm historical stories I make, it would mean a lot if you left a like and perhaps shared where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It helps others discover these peaceful journeys, and I'm always humbled to see how far they travel across the world. Let us begin not with the empire itself, but with the world that preceded it, a Europe caught between memory and becoming, where the ruins of Rome still stood against the sky, and new kingdoms were taking shape in the forests and valleys of the north. The year is sometime in the 6th century, though exact dates matter less than the feeling of those times. The Western Roman Empire, that vast structure of law and stone and legion, had ceased to exist as a unified entity several generations before. In the year 476, the last emperor in the West, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, had been quietly removed from power by a Germanic chieftain. It was not a dramatic end, no great conflagration or final battle. The empire simply stopped, like a clock winding down, its mechanisms no longer able to turn. What remained was a landscape of fragments. In the Italian peninsula, Gothic kings ruled from Ravenna, their courts a strange blend of Roman tradition and Germanic custom. In Gaul, the land that would become France, the Merovingian Franks had established themselves, their long-haired kings presiding over a realm that stretched from the Rhine to the Pyrenees. In Hispania, Visigothic monarchs held sway. Britain had fractured into Celtic kingdoms and Saxon settlements. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, now belonged to no single power. If you could have walked through these lands in those twilight years, you would have seen the physical remnants of Rome everywhere. The roads still stretched across the countryside, their paving stones worn smooth by centuries of feet and wheels. Aqueducts carried water to cities that had shrunk within their ancient walls. Amphitheaters stood empty, their arches framing nothing but sky. In some places, marble columns had been pulled down and repurposed, their carved capitals now serving as doorsteps or foundation stones for Christian churches. The church, here was the institution that had survived the empire's collapse, indeed had grown stronger in its absence. Bishops now functioned as civic leaders in many cities, their authority filling the vacuum left by departed Roman administrators. Monasteries dotted the landscape, islands of literacy and learning in a world where fewer and fewer people could read. In these quiet communities, monks copied manuscripts, preserving texts that would otherwise have been lost to time and decay. The Pope in Rome held a unique position. No, he was the Bishop of Rome, yes, but also something more. A living link to the Apostle Peter, a voice of spiritual authority that transcended the political chaos around him. Yet his temporal power was limited. Rome itself was a shadow of its former glory, its population having dwindled from perhaps 1 million at the empire's height to perhaps 30 or 40,000. The great forums lay in ruins, gardens growing among fallen columns. Cattle grazed in what had once been the heart of the civilized world. To the east, however, the Roman Empire continued. In Constantinople, emperors still ruled in the old ways, their administration a direct continuation of the ancient state. They spoke Greek now, rather than Latin, but they called themselves Romans still, and their empire would endure for another 1,000 years. They looked upon the West as lost territory, provinces temporarily misplaced, but rightfully theirs. Occasionally, they would send armies to reclaim Italy or North Africa, campaigns that brought brief periods of Byzantine rule before the frontiers shifted once again. The Germanic peoples who had settled throughout the former Western Empire were themselves in a state of transformation. They had not destroyed Roman civilization so much as merged with it, adopting its language in some places, its laws in others, its religion almost everywhere. By the 6th century, most of these kingdoms had converted from Arian Christianity, a heretical form in the eyes of Rome, to Catholic orthodoxy. This conversion was more than merely spiritual. It was political, aligning these new rulers with the Church and with the Romanized populations they governed. In Francia, the Frankish kingdom was slowly consolidating. The Merovingian kings, descendants of Clovis, who had converted to Catholicism around the year 500, ruled a realm that was more a collection of territories than a unified state. Real power often lay in the hands of their chief administrators, the mayors of the palace, who managed the kingdom's affairs, while the kings themselves became increasingly ceremonial figures. The landscape of Europe in these centuries was predominantly rural. Cities had contracted, and most people lived in small villages or on isolated farmsteads. The economy had largely reverted to localism, each region, each estate, producing what it needed to survive. Long-distance trade continued, but on a much reduced scale. The great merchant fleets that had once connected every port in the Mediterranean had dwindled. Roads fell into disrepair. Travel became dangerous, the realm of pilgrims and merchants willing to risk the journey. Yet this was not a dark age in the sense of being without light. Culture adapted and persisted. In Ireland, which had never been part of the Roman Empire, monasteries became centers of extraordinary learning. Irish monks developed a distinctive art style, creating illuminated manuscripts of breathtaking beauty. They would eventually travel to the continent as missionaries, carrying their learning with them, founding monasteries in places like Lox Uy and Bobbio. In Spain, despite Visigothic rule, centers of learning persisted. The Bishop Isidore of Seville compiled his Etymologies, an encyclopedic work attempting to preserve all knowledge. It was a symptom of the age's anxiety, the sense that knowledge was slipping away and must be gathered and saved before it disappeared entirely. The Lombards, having invaded Italy in the later 6th century, created their own kingdom in the north of the peninsula, leaving the Byzantines clinging to footholds in Rome, Ravenna, and the south. The Pope, caught between these powers, learned to navigate carefully, sometimes calling on the Byzantines for protection, sometimes negotiating with the Lombards, always working to maintain the independence and authority of the Roman See. It was a world in waiting, though those who lived in it could not have known what they were waiting for. They were simply living, farming, praying, governing as best they could. They built in wood where once there had been marble. They remembered dimly stories of a time when all the world had been one, under one law, speaking one language. Some hoped that unity might return. Others accepted fragmentation as the natural order of things. The physical environment shaped everything. Dense forests covered much of northern Europe. Vast stretches of oak and beech and pine, where the Roman legions had never managed to build their roads. The Rhine and Danube marked ancient frontiers, rivers that had divided the civilized world from the barbarian lands beyond. But now those distinctions had blurred. The descendants of those barbarians were Christian kings, and the old Roman territories were ruled by Germanic dynasties. Climate played its role too. These were relatively warm centuries before the colder periods that would come later. Crops grew well, populations slowly recovered from the plagues and disruptions of earlier times. Villages expanded. New lands were cleared for farming. The monastery at Monte Cassino, founded by Benedict of Nursia, established a rule for monastic life that would spread throughout Europe. A structured day of prayer and work, a balance that would become a cornerstone of medieval civilization. Technology persisted and evolved. Watermills became more common, grinding grain more efficiently than human labor could. Metalworking techniques, never entirely lost, were refined. The heavy plough, better suited to northern European soils than the light Mediterranean scratch plough, came into wider use, making agriculture more productive. Languages were shifting, evolving. Latin remained the language of the Church and of what administration existed, but the spoken tongues were diverging. In Gaul, Latin was becoming Old French. In Hispania, the various Romance dialects were emerging. In Italy, a dozen regional varieties of Latin-descended speech were taking shape. German languages dominated the regions east of the Rhine, while Celtic tongues held on in the far west. The monasteries were doing more than just preserving manuscripts. They were also focal points of agriculture, developing new techniques, clearing land, establishing model farms. They were schools, training the few literate men of the age. They were hospitals, caring for the sick and indigent. They were workshops, producing everything from beer to metalwork. In many ways, they were the most stable and innovative institutions of the age. Art in this period took on new forms. The naturalistic traditions of Roman sculpture gave way to more stylized symbolic representations. Mosaics in churches depicted Christ and the saints not as realistic figures, but as hieratic presences, frontal and eternal. Gold backgrounds replaced landscape. The aim was not to capture the appearance of things, but their spiritual reality. Music, too, was evolving. Gregorian chant, named for Pope Gregory I, though probably developed over many decades, created a distinctive sound for Christian worship. These modal melodies, sung in unison without accompaniment, would become the foundation of Western musical tradition. Into this world, fragmented yet connected, poor yet creative, looking backward yet slowly building something new, would come a family that would change everything. They were not emperors or philosophers. They were warriors and administrators from the Frankish heartland, rising through ability and circumstance to positions of ever greater power. They were the Carolingians, named for the man who would become their most famous representative. Charles, known to history as Charlemagne. But before Charles could build an empire, his family first had to build a kingdom, uniting the fractious Frankish territories under their control, extending their power east into Germanic lands, south into Italy, and establishing themselves as the paramount power in Western Europe. The stage was set. The actors were moving into position. The old world had passed away. The new world had not yet been born. And in that in-between time, in the valleys of the Rhine and the Meuse and the Seine, a power was gathering that would reach for the ghost of Rome and grasp it, briefly, bringing into being something that had not existed before and would not exist again in quite the same way. A Christian empire in the West, a successor to the Caesars, a realm that would call itself holy and Roman, though it was neither. But all that lay ahead. For now, there was simply the quiet continuation of life in a world between empires, where the past was ruins and the future was unwritten, and where, on any given evening, you might see the smoke rising from 100 village hearths, each one a point of light in the gathering dusk, each one a home where people ate and slept and dreamed, never suspecting that their world was about to change. The winter of 800 was cold in Rome, though not as cold as the lands beyond the Alps, where Charles, king of the Franks, had spent most of his life. He had come south at the request of Pope Leo III, who had faced violence and accusations from Roman nobles, and needed the protection that only the most powerful ruler in the West could provide. Charles was 58 years old, an advanced age for that era, a man who had spent 4 decades in near-constant campaigning, forging a kingdom into something much larger. Let us step back, though, to understand how this moment came to be. Charles was born around 742, though the exact date is uncertain, into a family that had already achieved remarkable power. His grandfather, Charles Martel, had been mayor of the palace under the nominal Merovingian kings, but it was Charles Martel who actually ruled Francia. In 732, at the Battle of Tours, he had defeated a Muslim raiding force that had crossed the Pyrenees from Al-Andalus, a victory that later generations would see as a defining moment for Christian Europe, though at the time it was simply one battle among many. Charles Martel's son, Pepin the Short, took the decisive step that his father had not. With the blessing of Pope Zachary, Pepin deposed the last Merovingian king in 751 and claimed the throne for himself. The Pope's approval was crucial. It transformed what might have been seen as usurpation into legitimate succession. Pepin was anointed in the biblical manner, consecrated with holy oil, his kingship made sacred. In return, when the Pope called for help against the Lombards threatening Rome, Pepin led his armies into Italy. The lands he took from the Lombards he gave not to the Byzantine Empire, which might have claimed them, but to the Pope himself. This was the beginning of the Papal States, the temporal domain that would make the Pope not just a spiritual leader, but a territorial ruler for more than 1,000 years. Charles inherited this kingdom in 768, sharing it initially with his brother Charlemagne. When Charlemagne died in 771, Charles became sole ruler of the Frankish realm. He was a man of extraordinary energy and ambition. Contemporary descriptions tell us he was tall, around 6 feet, unusually large for the time. He was robust, an enthusiastic hunter and swimmer. He was also intellectually curious, surrounding himself with scholars, learning to read though apparently never quite mastering writing. His reign became a near-constant series of military campaigns. He fought the Saxons in the north, a pagan Germanic people who resisted Frankish rule and Christian conversion with fierce determination. These Saxon wars would last more than 30 years, characterized by mutual atrocities and forced conversions. Eventually, through a combination of military victory and strategic settlement, Charles incorporated Saxony into his realm. He campaigned in Spain, pushing into the Muslim territories of Al-Andalus with mixed success. It was during a return from one such campaign that his rearguard was ambushed at Roncesvalles in 778, an event that would later be immortalized in the epic Song of Roland, though the historical reality was far less glorious than the later legend. He conquered the Lombard kingdom in northern Italy in 774, taking the title King of the Lombards for himself and becoming the protector of Rome. He pushed east, defeating the Avars, a nomadic people whose realm had stretched across the Hungarian plain, seizing their treasure hoard, gold and silver accumulated from centuries of raiding and tribute-taking, and using it to enrich his kingdom and reward his followers. By the end of the 8th century, Charles ruled an empire that stretched from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic to the borders of the Slavic lands. It was the largest realm in Western Europe since the fall of Rome, and it was growing still. But Charles was more than just a conqueror. He understood that military victory was not enough, that a realm of this size needed infrastructure, administration, culture. He established a capital at Aachen in the heartland of his territories, building a palace complex that included a magnificent chapel modeled on Byzantine churches. The chapel still stands, its octagonal form and striped arches a testament to the ambitions of its builder. He gathered scholars from throughout Europe, Alcuin from England, Theodulf from Spain, Paul the Deacon from Italy, Einhard from his own Frankish lands. These men formed what historians would later call the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning and literacy. They standardized the script used for copying manuscripts, developing the clear, legible, minuscule writing that would become the basis for modern lowercase letters. They corrected texts of the Bible and classical authors that had become corrupted through centuries of copying. They wrote new works of theology and history. Charles issued capitularies, decrees that covered everything from the proper conduct of priests to the standardization of weights and measures. He sent out royal inspectors, the missi dominici, traveling in pairs throughout the realm to ensure his laws were being followed and justice was being done. He reformed the coinage, instituted a system of local counts to administer territories, and expected regular military service from his nobles. He also promoted the church, not just as a spiritual institution, but as an instrument of governance and cultural unity. He insisted on clerical education, established new bishoprics in conquered territories, and supported missionary work among pagan peoples. The Christianity he promoted was Roman in orientation, tied to the papacy, distinct from the traditions that had developed in Ireland or the Eastern churches. By the year 800, Charles ruled a realm that was, in many ways, a successor to the Western Roman Empire. It covered similar territory, used similar administrative structures, promoted a universal religion and culture. And yet, officially, he was merely a king, albeit a supremely powerful one. Then came Christmas Day, 800, in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The accounts of what happened that day were written by people with their own perspectives and agendas, and the exact sequence of events remains debated. What seems clear is that as Charles knelt in prayer during the Mass, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon his head, and the assembled Romans acclaimed him as emperor. Charles, according to his biographer Einhard, was taken by surprise and even displeased, claiming he would not have entered the church had he known what the Pope planned. This may be true, or it may be diplomatic fiction designed to mollify the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, who was, after all, the only legitimate Roman emperor. Crowning another emperor in the West was, from the Byzantine perspective, either heresy or rebellion, or both. But whatever Charles's initial reaction, he did not refuse the title. He was now Carolus Augustus, emperor and Augustus, governing the Romans. It was an audacious claim, one that rested on military power, papal approval, and the fiction or hope that the Roman Empire could be reconstituted in the West. The title transformed the political landscape of Europe. It created a rival to the Byzantine Empire, though the Byzantines never accepted this claim as legitimate. It elevated the Pope to kingmaker, the one who could confer imperial dignity. It made Charles not merely the most powerful ruler in the West, but something more, the defender of Christendom, the secular arm of the Church, the heir to Constantine and Augustus. The remaining years of Charles's life, he died in 814, were spent consolidating what he had built. He divided his realm among his sons in the traditional Frankish manner, but death intervened. By the time Charles died, only one son, Louis, survived. Louis inherited the entire empire intact, though he lacked his father's force of personality and military skill. Charles was buried in his chapel at Aachen, seated on a throne, clothed in imperial regalia, the Gospels open on his lap. Later generations would open his tomb and find him there, exactly as he had been left, or so they claimed. The truth of such stories matters less than what they reveal. The hold Charles had on the imagination of those who came after. The sense that he represented something important. A moment when the West had achieved unity and redness. In the villages and fields far from Aachen and Rome, life went on much as it always had. Peasants farmed, paid their dues, attended their churches. They might hear that the king was now an emperor, but it would change little in their daily existence. The roads were no better, the winters no warmer, the work no less hard. Yet something had shifted. An idea had been born, or rather, reborn, the idea that Western Europe could be united under a single Christian ruler, that the ghost of Rome could walk again. It was an idea that would haunt European history for 1,000 years, inspiring and justifying and complicating the reigns of dozens of rulers who would claim the imperial title. The empire Charles built would not long survive him as a unified entity. Within a generation, it would be divided among his grandsons, fragmenting into kingdoms that would eventually become France, Germany, and Italy. But the title would persist, passing eventually to the German kings, becoming attached to a realm centered on the Germanic territories, a realm that would call itself the Holy Roman Empire, claiming continuity with Charles, with Rome, with Constantine. As snow fell on Aachen in the winter following Charles's death, his son Louis attempted to hold together what his father had built. He was a pious man, serious and conscientious, but the forces pulling the empire apart were stronger than his ability to resist them. The nobles wanted autonomy, his own sons wanted kingdoms, the Pope wanted independence, the Byzantines wanted recognition of their sole right to the imperial title. Yet for a brief moment, on that Christmas day in 800, it must have seemed possible. A unified Christian empire in the West, strong enough to defend itself, prosperous enough to support learning and art, stable enough to endure. In the candlelight of St. Peter's, with the ancient stones of Rome all around, with the Pope and the Frankish nobles and the Roman clergy watching, Charles knelt as a king and rose as an emperor. It was theatre, certainly, but theatre with meaning, a ritual that transformed reality, or tried to. The wind off the Tiber was cold that winter, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and the distant sea. The city's ancient walls still stood, enclosing far more space than the shrunken population needed. Sheep grazed among the ruins of the Forum. The Colosseum was slowly being stripped of its stones to build fortifications and churches. But in that moment, in that church, Rome was again the center of the world, if only symbolically. And Charles, warrior, administrator, patron of learning, king of the Franks and Lombards, now emperor of the Romans, had achieved what no one in the West had achieved for more than 3 centuries. He had made himself the equal, at least in title and power, of the emperors in Constantinople. He had given the Pope a protector and patron. He had created a political structure that would outlast him, however transformed. The monks in their scriptoria would write of this moment for generations, copying and recopying the accounts, illuminating manuscripts with images of Charles crowned and enthroned. The legend would grow larger than the man, as legends do. But the man himself, in his final years, remained focused on practical matters, ensuring justice, maintaining his armies, promoting learning, defending his frontiers, preparing his son for the burdens of rule. When the spring came, Charles left Rome and returned north, crossing the Alps once more, making his way through passes still often blocked by snow, returning to the forested lands where he was most at home, where the air was cold and clear and the hunting was good. The imperial crown came with him, a physical object of gold and jewels that would be passed down through generations, though what it represented, power, authority, legitimacy, remained contested, subject to interpretation, a symbol whose meaning would shift with every bearer. Behind him, Rome settled back into its troubled existence, the Pope navigating the politics of Italian nobles and distant emperors, the population continuing their lives in the shadow of ancient greatness. And ahead, in the future that none could see, lay centuries of emperors and anti-emperors, of conflicts between popes and kings, of the slow construction of something new from the materials of the old, a realm that would claim to be holy and Roman and an empire, though it would never be all 3 at once. The chapel at Aachen stands quiet in the early morning, its marble columns rising into shadow, mosaics catching the first light through ancient windows. This was the heart of Charles's empire, and here his son Louis the Pious attempted to continue what his father had begun. But empires built on the strength of one extraordinary man often struggle when lesser mortals take the helm. Louis was crowned co-emperor by his father in 813, a year before Charles died. The coronation took place not in Rome, but in Aachen, performed not by the Pope, but by Charles himself. This was deliberate, an assertion that imperial authority derived from the emperor and from God, not from papal consecration. But after Charles's death, the forces of fragmentation proved stronger than Louis's ability to maintain unity. Louis was called the Pious for good reason. He was deeply religious, surrounding himself with monks and reformers, concerning himself with the proper conduct of the Church and the moral state of his realm. He held assemblies where complaints could be heard and justice dispensed. He supported monasteries and bishoprics, reformed the religious life of his kingdom, worked to ensure that clergy were educated and disciplined. But he faced problems his father had not. The empire was too large to govern effectively with the communications and administrative tools available. Local nobles had always enjoyed considerable autonomy, and they were growing increasingly independent. The Vikings had begun their raids on coastal regions, appearing without warning in their swift ships, plundering monasteries and towns before disappearing back to sea. And most problematically, Louis had several adult sons, each of whom expected to rule a kingdom. The Frankish tradition was to divide a realm among surviving sons. Louis attempted to formalize this through several succession plans, but each plan created new grievances. His sons rebelled against him, sometimes individually, sometimes in coalition with each other, sometimes in alliance with various nobles and bishops who had their own grievances. In 833, Louis was publicly humiliated, forced to perform penance, and temporarily deposed by his own sons and the bishops they had persuaded to join their rebellion. He was restored to power, but his authority never fully recovered. When he died in 840, his surviving sons went to war with each other, a conflict that would reshape the empire fundamentally. The three main contenders were Lothar, the eldest, who held the imperial title and claimed supremacy over his brothers; Louis the German, who controlled the eastern Germanic-speaking territories; and Charles the Bald, who ruled in the west in what would become France. Their war was bitter and destructive, armies crisscrossing the landscape, monasteries and estates caught in the fighting. In 842, the two younger brothers, Louis and Charles, met at Strasbourg and swore oaths of mutual support against their elder brother. These oaths are significant to historians because they were sworn in two languages. Louis swore in an early form of French so Charles's men could understand him, and Charles swore in an early form of German so Louis's men could understand him. The text of these oaths survives, one of the earliest documents in the languages that would become French and German, evidence that the linguistic unity of the Carolingian Empire was already fracturing. The war ended with the Treaty of Verdun in 843, one of the most consequential agreements in European history. The empire was divided three ways. Lothar kept the imperial title and received a middle kingdom stretching from the Low Countries through Burgundy and across the Alps to Italy. Louis the German received the eastern territories, the Germanic lands. Charles the Bald received the western territories, essentially Francia itself. This division was presented as temporary, a pragmatic solution to the succession crisis. In reality, it began the permanent division of Western Europe into separate political entities. The Middle Kingdom, Lotharingia, would be fought over for centuries, its territories eventually absorbed by its neighbours. The Eastern and Western kingdoms would become, over time, Germany and France. But the Carolingian dynasty didn't immediately disappear. Its members continued to rule in various kingdoms for another century and more, though increasingly as figureheads, while real power passed to regional nobles. The pattern was similar across all three kingdoms. Counts and dukes who had been appointed as royal officials gradually made their positions hereditary, accumulating land and power, owing less and less real allegiance to distant kings. In the East, the German kingdom, the process was complicated by external threats. The Magyars, a nomadic people from the steppes, began raiding deep into Germany and Italy in the late 9th and early 10th centuries. These raids were devastating, comparable to the earlier Viking attacks in the West. Communities lived in fear of the sudden appearance of Magyar horsemen, who struck without warning and vanished before any defense could be organized. The response to these threats required military leadership and local organization. The German dukes, leaders of the tribal groupings that made up the Eastern Kingdom, became increasingly independent, raising armies, fortifying positions, dealing with the Magyar threat without much reference to the nominal king. By the early 10th century, the last Carolingian king in Germany died without a clear heir, and the dukes elected one of their own, Conrad of Franconia, as king. Conrad's reign was unsuccessful, marked by conflicts with other dukes and an inability to deal effectively with the Magyar threat. When he died in 918, he recommended that the dukes elect not one of his own relatives, but Henry of Saxony, the duke whose territories bordered the hostile Slavic lands to the east. The dukes agreed, and Henry became king. In the Western Kingdom, the pattern was similar, but led to a different outcome. The Carolingian line continued, but became increasingly powerless. Real authority fell to regional nobles, particularly the Counts of Paris, who proved effective at defending against Viking raids. In 987, when the last Carolingian king died without a viable heir, the nobles elected Hugh Capet, Count of Paris, as king. The Capetian dynasty would rule France for more than 800 years. In Italy, the situation was more complex. The Kingdom of Italy, theoretically part of the empire, was contested among various Carolingian heirs, local nobles, and occasional interventions from the German kingdom. The imperial title itself became contested, sometimes claimed by rulers who controlled Italy, sometimes falling vacant for years at a time. Through all this political fragmentation, certain Carolingian achievements endured. The script developed in Charles's scriptoria continued to be used and spread. The manuscripts copied in the 9th century preserved texts that would otherwise have been lost. The model of kingship Charles established, the idea that a king should be not just a war leader, but also a patron of learning, a promoter of justice, a defender of the church, remained influential. The palace schools that Charles and Louis had supported produced generations of educated clergy and administrators. These men carried Carolingian ideas about governance and learning to monasteries and bishoprics throughout Europe. Even as the political unity of the empire dissolved, a certain cultural unity persisted, rooted in Latin literacy, Roman Christianity, and the memory of what Charles had achieved. Monasteries continued to be centers of learning and agricultural development. The monastery at Cluny, founded in 910 in Burgundy, would become particularly influential, promoting a reformed Benedictine monasticism that emphasized liturgical beauty, independence from local nobles, and direct connection to the papacy. From Cluny, reform spread to hundreds of other monasteries, creating networks of houses following similar rules and practices. In England, which had never been part of Charles's empire but had been influenced by Carolingian learning, King Alfred the Great in the late 9th century promoted a similar revival of learning and literacy. He translated Latin works into Old English, established schools, reformed law codes, and successfully defended his kingdom against Viking invasion. His achievement was both independent of and parallel to what the Carolingians had attempted, evidence that the impulse to restore learning and order was widespread. The Vikings themselves were gradually changing. The raids that had terrorized coastal Europe in the 9th century gave way in the 10th century to settlement and integration. In northern Francia, Vikings settled in what would become Normandy, adopting Christianity and the French language while maintaining some of their martial culture. They would eventually produce some of the most effective warriors and administrators in Europe. In the eastern regions, along the Baltic and into what would become Russia, Swedish Vikings, called Rus, established trading routes and eventually states, mixing with Slavic populations, eventually adopting Orthodox Christianity from Byzantium. The Rus state, centered on Kiev, would become a significant power, a link between Scandinavia, Byzantium, and the Islamic world. The landscape of Europe in the 10th century was thus both fragmented and interconnected. Politically divided into dozens of kingdoms, duchies, and counties, it was nonetheless bound together by the Latin Church, by memories of Roman and Carolingian unity, by networks of trade and pilgrimage, by shared culture and language among the educated elite. Villages grew slowly, forests were cleared, new lands brought under cultivation. The warming climate of these centuries made agriculture more productive. Water mills and improved ploughing techniques increased yields. Population recovered from the plagues and disruptions of earlier times. In the monasteries, in the cathedrals, in the courts of kings and nobles, the business of life continued. Scribes copied manuscripts, sometimes adding marginal notes of complaint about the cold or their cramped fingers. Bishops administered their dioceses, dealing with disputes over tithes and property. Nobles went to war with each other over inheritance and territory, observing increasingly elaborate rules about the conduct of warfare among Christians. The peasants who made up the vast majority of the population lived lives that remained much as they had been for generations. They worked the land, paid their dues to their lord and their tithes to the church, attended Mass on Sundays, celebrated the great feasts of the Christian year. Their world was local, bounded by the nearest town or castle, by the fields they worked, and the village where they lived. Yet even in this localism, there were connections to the wider world. The church was universal, its calendar the same everywhere, its Latin liturgy recognizable, whether one heard it in Spain or in Saxony. pilgrims travelled to holy sites, bringing back stories of distant places. Merchants carried goods along trade routes that stretched from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic to the boundaries of the Islamic world. The idea of empire, of a unified Christian realm in the West, had not died with the division at Verdun. It had merely been deferred, waiting for a ruler strong enough to claim it and an opportunity to make the claim stick. That opportunity would come in the 10th century in the German kingdom, where a Saxon duke would prove himself capable of defeating not just rival nobles, but the Magyar raiders who had terrorized Central Europe for decades. In the quiet of a monastery library, a monk copies a chronicle, recording the reigns of kings and the succession of bishops, the foundation of churches and the dates of battles. He writes in clear Carolingian minuscule, the product of reforms begun more than a century before. Outside his window, the world goes about its business, unaware of or unconcerned with the larger patterns of history, focused on the immediate, the harvest, the weather, the local lord, the next meal. But history was moving, slowly and unevenly, toward a new configuration. The fragmentation that followed Charles's death was not the end of the story, but rather a necessary transition, a period of adjustment and reorganization. From the chaos of competing kingdoms and external invasions, new structures were emerging. Feudal relationships, binding lord and vassal, the growing power of the church as a separate political entity, the development of regional identities that would eventually become national ones. The imperial title, in abeyance or contested for much of the 10th century, awaited a ruler who could give it meaning again. The papacy, having crowned Charles emperor, had established a precedent and a prerogative that it would not willingly surrender. And in the eastern reaches of the old Carolingian realm, in the German lands where the defense against Magyar and Slav had created strong military leadership, the pieces were coming together for a new assertion of imperial authority. The wind blows through the ruined Roman aqueducts, across fields where peasants bend to their work, through the cloisters of monasteries where monks chant the hours. Time passes, seasons turn, generations come and go. The grand narratives of emperors and popes are punctuated by countless small narratives, lives lived, children born, deaths mourned, work done, prayers said. And through it all, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the shape of medieval Europe continues to form. In the middle years of the 10th century, in the lands east of the Rhine, a duke's son came of age in a world still bearing scars from Magyar raids. His name was Otto, and he was born into the Saxon nobility around 912, son of Henry the Fowler, who had united the German duchies under his kingship through a combination of military skill and political acumen. Otto would do more than continue his father's work. He would transform the kingdom into an empire, claiming for the Germans the imperial title that had lapsed into obscurity since the Carolingians. Henry the Fowler had died in 936, and Otto had been elected king by the assembled dukes, as was the custom. But election did not guarantee obedience. The German kingdom was a confederation of powerful duchies, Saxony, Bavaria, Franconia, Swabia, Lotharingia, each with its own traditions and interests. The dukes who elected the king expected to remain largely autonomous, paying homage but not necessarily obedience. Otto understood that he needed to establish his authority firmly. He did this through a combination of military force, strategic marriages, and the cultivation of the church as a counterweight to the secular nobility. His reign would be marked by repeated rebellions from nobles who resented his centralizing efforts. But Otto proved both ruthless and persistent in suppressing these challenges. The most significant threat to the kingdom, however, came not from within, but from outside. The Magyars continued their raids, penetrating deep into German territory and into Italy and France. These were not mere banditry, but organized military expeditions, with Magyar horsemen appearing suddenly, overwhelming local defenses, seizing captives and treasure, then vanishing before any coordinated response could be mounted. In 955, a large Magyar force invaded Bavaria, besieging the city of Augsburg. This time, Otto was ready. He assembled an army drawn from across his kingdom and met the Magyars in battle at the Lechfeld, south of Augsburg. The battle was hard fought, but Otto's forces prevailed decisively. The Magyar army was shattered, its leaders captured and executed. It was the end of the Magyar threat to Western Europe. The survivors retreated to the Hungarian plain, where they would gradually settle, convert to Christianity, and establish the Kingdom of Hungary, eventually becoming part of the European family of nations rather than its terrorizer. Otto's victory at the Lechfeld was more than just a military triumph. It established him as the paramount defender of Christendom in the West, comparable to Charles Martel's victory over the Muslims at Tours 2 centuries earlier. The German princes who had fought alongside him could hardly deny his authority after such a victory. The prestige he gained was immense, transforming him from a strong king into something approaching the legendary status of Charlemagne. But Otto had ambitions beyond Germany. He looked south to Italy, where the situation was chaotic. The kingdom of Italy was contested among various local rulers. The papacy itself was in disarray, with Roman noble families controlling the selection of popes, who often proved more interested in Italian politics than spiritual leadership. Otto intervened in Italy multiple times. He claimed the crown of Italy in 951, marrying Adelaide of Italy to strengthen his legitimacy. He returned in 962 in response to an appeal from Pope John XII, who was facing threats from Berengar of Ivrea. Otto defeated Berengar and restored the Pope to security. In return, on February 2, 962, Pope John XII crowned Otto as emperor. It was a deliberate revival of the Carolingian precedent, a reassertion of the idea that there should be a Christian emperor in the West. But the relationship between Otto and the Pope was different from that between Charles and Leo. Otto made it clear that he was the dominant partner. He issued the Ottonianum, a document that confirmed the Pope's territorial possessions, but also asserted the emperor's right to approve papal elections, effectively making the papacy subordinate to imperial authority. When Pope John XII subsequently conspired against him, Otto convened a synod in Rome that deposed John and elected a new pope, Leo VIII. It was an extraordinary assertion of power, one that would have been unthinkable for Charlemagne. Otto was establishing the principle that the empire was not a gift of the papacy, but rather a separate institution with authority over the church in temporal matters. Otto's empire was different from Charlemagne's in several ways. It was more Germanic, centered on the eastern territories rather than Francia. It included Italy, but not France, which was developing as a separate kingdom under the Capetians. And it was more consciously structured around the church as an instrument of governance. Otto and his successors developed what historians call the imperial church system, or Reichskirche. They appointed bishops and abbots to key positions throughout the empire, granting them territorial authority as well as spiritual responsibility. Because these churchmen could not legally marry or pass their positions to sons, they could not create hereditary dynasties to challenge royal authority. They were, in theory, dependent on the king-emperor for their positions and loyal to him rather than to local noble families. This system had the additional advantage that educated clergy made better administrators than most nobles, who were often illiterate. Bishops and abbots could keep records, handle diplomatic correspondence, understand law and theology, and manage complex estates efficiently. Otto established his court in the northern cities, Magdeburg, Quedlinburg, Merseburg, building churches and monasteries, promoting learning in the Carolingian tradition. His court became a center of culture, attracting scholars and artists. The Ottonian Renaissance, as it's sometimes called, produced distinctive art and architecture. Manuscripts with vivid, stylized illuminations, churches with high naves and solid towers, metalwork of extraordinary craftsmanship. The famous Gero crucifix, created around 965 to 970, exemplifies Ottonian art. It's a life-size wooden sculpture of Christ on the cross, one of the earliest large-scale sculptures of the medieval period. Christ is depicted not in triumph, but in suffering, a human figure experiencing death. The work is both monumental and deeply emotional, technical mastery in service of spiritual expression. Otto died in 973, having established the empire on a firm foundation. His son Otto II inherited a realm that was recognized throughout Europe as the paramount power in the West. But maintaining the empire would prove challenging for his successors. Otto II attempted to extend imperial authority into southern Italy, campaigning against the Byzantine territories there and against Muslim forces from Sicily. The campaign ended in disaster at the Battle of Stylo in 982, where Otto's army was defeated and he barely escaped with his life. He died the following year, still in his 20s, leaving a 3-year-old son, Otto III, as his heir. Otto III's reign was brief but fascinating. Influenced by his Byzantine mother, Theophanu, and his grandmother Adelaide, and educated by scholars, including the brilliant Gerber of Aurillac, later Pope Sylvester II, Otto III developed an idealistic vision of empire. He dreamed of renewing the Roman Empire, not as a German kingdom, but as a universal Christian realm centered on Rome itself. He moved his court to Rome, established himself on the Palatine Hill, where the ancient emperors had dwelt, and surrounded himself with advisors drawn from across Europe. He spoke of restoring the glory of Rome, issued coins proclaiming Renovatio Imperii Romanorum, renewal of the Roman Empire, and treated the Pope as a partner rather than a subordinate, even traveling on pilgrimage to the tomb of Charlemagne in Aachen to seek inspiration from his imperial predecessor. But Otto III died in 1002 at only 21, his grand vision unrealized. The Roman nobles, never comfortable with this foreign emperor in their city, had forced him to flee Rome shortly before his death. His body was brought back to Germany for burial in the cathedral at Aachen, next to Charlemagne himself. The empire passed to Henry II, a distant cousin from the Bavarian branch of the family. Henry was a capable ruler, more focused on Germany itself than on grand imperial visions. He was deeply pious, founded numerous monasteries and churches, and worked to reform the church. He would be canonized as a saint in 1146, the only medieval emperor to receive that honor. Under these Ottonian emperors, Otto I, Otto II, Otto III, and Henry II, the Holy Roman Empire took its characteristic shape. It was primarily a German kingdom that included northern Italy and claimed a special relationship with the papacy and with Rome itself. The emperor was elected by the German princes, then crowned as King of Italy in northern Italy, and finally crowned as emperor in Rome by the Pope. The empire was never a centralized state in the way modern nations are. It was rather a confederation of territories bound together by personal oaths to the emperor, by the network of bishops and abbots appointed by the emperor, and by shared participation in a Christian polity that saw itself as the earthly counterpart to the city of God. In villages throughout the empire, life continued much as it had before. Peasants farmed, paid their dues, attended church. They might hear that there was an emperor, might even see him or his retinue pass through on the way to Italy or Rome. But their daily existence remained local and immediate. The seasons mattered more than the succession of kings, the weather more than imperial politics. Yet the existence of the empire created a framework, a structure that influenced everything within it, even if most people were only dimly aware of its workings. Disputes between nobles might be appealed to the emperor for judgment. Bishops were answerable to imperial authority as well as to Rome. The ideal of a unified Christian realm, even if imperfectly realized, provided a reference point, a standard against which reality could be measured. In the monasteries, monks chanted the liturgy of the hours, the same prayers at the same times every day, year after year, generation after generation. This, too, was an empire of sorts, an empire of the spirit, bound together not by armies and oaths, but by shared ritual and belief, by the invisible bonds of prayer. The great cathedrals built in this period, solid, massive structures with thick walls and small windows, designed more like fortresses than the soaring Gothic cathedrals that would come later, embodied the Ottonian spirit. They were built to last, to withstand siege, to serve as refuges in time of war, but they were also houses of prayer, spaces designed to direct the mind toward God, their height and their art serving a spiritual purpose. Trade was increasing, slowly. Towns were growing, though they remained small by modern standards. Markets brought together people from surrounding regions, merchants from distant lands. Pilgrims traveled the roads, heading for Rome or Santiago de Compostela or Jerusalem. These movements of people spread ideas as well as goods, creating connections across the fragmented political landscape. The empire that Otto the Great revived in 962 would continue for more than 800 years until Napoleon finally dissolved it in 1806. But it was always a peculiar institution, neither a kingdom nor a mere confederation, neither fully German nor fully Italian, claiming to be the continuation of Rome, yet undeniably medieval and Christian in character. Its greatest achievement was perhaps simply persisting, providing a framework of order and legitimacy in a world that might otherwise have fragmented entirely into warring local powers. It never achieved the unity or power of its Roman predecessor, but it maintained an idea, the idea that Europe could be more than just a collection of rival kingdoms, that there could be an overarching structure reflecting the unity of Christendom itself. As winter settled over the empire in those early years, snow covering the fields and forests, fires burning in the halls of nobles and peasants alike, the empire endured. In Magdeburg, in Aachen, in Rome, the business of government continued. In hundreds of monasteries, monks copied manuscripts and sang their prayers. In thousands of villages, people lived and worked and worshipped, their lives shaped by forces both immediate and distant, local and imperial, temporal and eternal. And in all of this there was a rhythm, a pattern, not the dramatic rise and fall of empires in rapid succession, but the slower, steadier beat of a civilization maintaining itself, adapting to change, absorbing shocks, continuing despite setbacks and disasters. It was less heroic than the stories of great conquerors, but it was perhaps more fundamentally important, the patient work of building and maintaining a social order that could support millions of lives, generation after generation, across centuries. Let us step away from the halls of emperors and the ceremonies of coronation, and walk instead through the ordinary world, the world as most people experienced it within the boundaries of the Holy Roman Empire in the 11th and 12th centuries. This was a world of manor and monastery, of village and town, of field and forest, where life moved to rhythms set by the season and the sun, the church bell and the harvest. Imagine a village somewhere in Swabia, or Franconia, or perhaps Lombardy. It is not named in the chronicles, not marked on the few maps that exist. It is simply one of thousands of such places scattered across the empire, home to perhaps 60 or 80 souls who live and work and die without leaving written record of their existence. The village centers on the church, a stone structure that is the largest and most permanent building in the settlement. Its bell tower marks the hours, calling the faithful to Mass, warning of danger, celebrating marriages and mourning deaths. The church is both sacred space and community center, the one place where everyone gathers regularly, regardless of status. Surrounding the church are houses, not the substantial timber or brick structures that would develop later, but simpler dwellings, often built of wattle and daub, with thatched roofs and dirt floors. Each house is dark inside, lit only by the fire in the hearth, and whatever sunlight enters through the small windows, if there are windows at all. The hearth is the center of life, providing warmth, light, and the means to cook food. Most villagers are peasants, bound to the land they work. Some are technically free, but practically little different from those who are serfs. They work fields that belong to a lord, perhaps a local noble, perhaps a monastery or bishop. In return for their labor and a portion of their produce, They have the right to work strips of land for themselves and to use the common pasture for their livestock. The agricultural year structures everything. Spring brings ploughing and planting, work that begins at dawn and continues until dusk. The heavy plough, drawn by oxen, turns the soil in long strips across the open fields. Seeds are scattered by hand, broadcast across the turned earth. There are prayers for good weather, for rain when needed, and sun for the harvest. Summer brings maintenance, weeding, tending to livestock, repairing tools and buildings. It is also the season when the Lord might demand additional labor, particularly if there is building to be done, or harvests to be gathered on the domain, the portion of land the Lord keeps for his own use. Autumn is harvest, the most critical time of year. Everyone works, from children to the elderly, gathering grain before weather can destroy it. The community's survival for the coming year depends on these few crucial weeks. There is anxiety until the harvest is safely stored, and then, if it has been good, relief and celebration. The Church's Harvest Festival gives thanks to God for his provision. Winter brings a slowing of agricultural work, but not rest. There is threshing to be done, tools to repair, animals to care for. The days are short, the nights long. People huddle by their fires, consuming the food they have stored, hoping it will last until spring. In hard years, winter is a time of hunger, when the weakest, the very young, the very old, the already ill, are most likely to die. Throughout all this, there are obligations to fulfill. Tithes, 10% of produce, go to the Church. Additional payments in kind or labor go to the Lord. There are fees for using the Lord's mill to grind grain, the Lord's oven to bake bread, the Lord's winepress. These monopolies, called banalités, are sources of income for the Lord and constant irritation for the peasants. Justice is administered at the manor court, where the Lord or his steward hears disputes and punishes offences. The punishments can be harsh: fines, public humiliation, physical punishment, in extreme cases, death. But the system also provides structure and predictability, ways to resolve conflicts without private violence. Life in a monastery, meanwhile, follows different rhythms. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed in most monasteries throughout the empire, structures the day around 8 periods of communal prayer, beginning with matins in the middle of the night and continuing through lauds at dawn. Prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and finally compline before sleep. Between these prayers, monks work, some in the fields and gardens, some in workshops producing everything from bread to metalwork, some in the scriptorium copying manuscripts, some in administration managing the monastery's lands and business affairs. The ideal is a balance between prayer and work, contemplation and action, expressed in the phrase ora et labora. Pray and work. Monasteries in this period are often large landowners, with dozens or even hundreds of manors providing income. They are also centres of learning, maintaining libraries and schools. The education is primarily practical, learning to read Latin for the liturgy, understanding theological texts, copying manuscripts. But this work preserves knowledge, maintaining literate culture in a largely illiterate world. Some monasteries are also centres of hospitality, maintaining guest houses for travellers and pilgrims. The monastery at Cluny, for instance, welcomes thousands of visitors each year, providing shelter, food, and assistance. This hospitality is seen as a Christian duty, a way of serving Christ through serving others. For nobles, life follows yet another pattern. A noble household is constantly in motion, travelling between different estates, consuming the produce of each before moving to the next. The household includes not just family, but retainers, servants, knights, officials, a community of perhaps dozens or hundreds, depending on the noble's rank. The noble's primary occupation is warfare. Training begins in childhood, boys learning to ride, to handle weapons, to serve first as pages and then as squires before becoming knights. Warfare is not constant, but it is frequent enough. Disputes over territory, enforcement of the emperor's or duke's authority, defense against external threats, or simply displays of power and status. But warfare itself is changing in this period. The chaotic violence of earlier centuries is gradually being constrained by evolving codes of conduct. The Church promotes the peace of God and truce of God movements, attempting to limit when and against whom warfare can be conducted. Certain days, Sundays and holy days, are to be free of fighting. Certain people, clergy, peasants, merchants, are to be protected. These rules are not always followed, but their existence indicates a growing sense that violence should be limited and directed according to principles. Tournaments become popular as a way for knights to practice combat skills and display prowess in settings that, while still dangerous, are less destructive than actual warfare. These tournaments are not the carefully orchestrated pageants they would later become, but chaotic melees where groups of knights fight each other for ransom and glory. Women's lives vary greatly by status. Peasant women work alongside men in the fields, manage households, bear and raise children in conditions where both childbirth and childhood are dangerous. Many women die young, worn out by repeated pregnancies and hard labor. Yet they are essential to the economy. Their work in agricultural production, textile manufacture, and household management crucial to survival. Noble women have different responsibilities. They manage estates when their husbands are away, overseeing administrators, hearing accounts, dispensing justice. They arrange marriages for their children, engaging in the complex diplomacy of family alliances. Some receive education, learning to read, sometimes to manage accounts. A few become quite powerful, ruling as regents or in their own right as widows or abbesses. The Church offers another path for women. Monasteries and convents provide opportunities for learning and authority not generally available in secular life. Abbesses rule their communities, managing lands and resources, making decisions that affect hundreds of people. Some become significant political figures, advising rulers and corresponding with popes. The famous Hildegard of Bingen, visionary and scholar, is still decades in the future in the period we're describing. But she represents possibilities that existed for exceptional women in religious life. Towns are growing in number and size during these centuries. They begin as markets, places where people from surrounding areas gather to exchange goods. The most successful markets become permanent settlements, with craftsmen and merchants establishing shops and homes. Towns typically cluster around castles or monasteries, benefiting from their protection and custom. Urban life is different from rural life. Town dwellers are generally free from manorial obligations, their status determined by their trade and property rather than by bonds to a lord. They live more densely, in buildings often built of stone or substantial timber, sharing walls with neighbours. Streets are narrow, unpaved, muddy in rain, dusty in dry weather. Sanitation is minimal, waste thrown into the streets or nearby rivers. Craftsmen organise into guilds, associations that control who can practice each trade, set standards for work, and provide mutual support for members. A boy wishing to become a craftsman typically apprentices to a master, learning the trade over several years before becoming a journeyman, and eventually, if successful, a master himself. Merchants range from local traders selling at weekly markets to long-distance merchants who travel or send agents across Europe and beyond, dealing in luxury goods, spices, silks, furs, fine textiles. These merchants are becoming wealthy, in some cases rivaling nobles in their resources. Their wealth is different, though. Liquid, invested in goods and trade rather than land. This will eventually give rise to new forms of economic and political power. The landscape itself is being transformed. Forests are being cleared, new lands brought under cultivation. Mills are being built along rivers, harnessing water power for grinding grain, fulling cloth, operating bellows for forges. Technology is advancing, slowly but steadily. Improved harnesses for horses, better metallurgy, mechanical clocks appearing in churches and monasteries. Roads are maintained to varying degrees, better in some regions than others. The old Roman roads still provide the best routes where they survive, their paving stones bearing testimony to a civilization long gone. New bridges are being built, often funded by the church or wealthy merchants, sometimes with chapels attached where travellers can pray for safe passage. Rivers serve as highways, boats carrying goods more efficiently than overland transport. The Rhine, the Danube, the Po, the Rhone, these are arteries of trade, their currents carrying lumber and wine, grain and salt, connecting the northern and southern portions of the empire. Pilgrimage is a significant activity. People travel to local shrines, to major pilgrimage sites like Rome or Santiago de Compostela, even to Jerusalem if they are wealthy and hardy enough. These journeys are acts of devotion, but they are also adventures, opportunities to see the world beyond one's birthplace, to meet people from distant regions, to visit markets and witness wonders. Literacy remains limited, but is gradually spreading. Most nobles and merchants cannot read, conducting business through memory and oral agreements. But the Church promotes literacy among clergy, and schools attached to cathedrals begin to attract more students, including some laymen seeking education for administrative careers. Medicine is a mixture of ancient learning preserved from Greek and Roman sources, practical experience, and religious belief. Physicians trained in university settings understand disease through the theory of humours, treating illness by attempting to restore balance through diet, bleeding, purging. Folk medicine, preserved by wise women in villages, relies on herbs and charms, some effective, some not. The Church sees illness as potentially linked to sin, promoting prayer and pilgrimage as cures alongside physical treatments. Entertainment varies by class and season. Peasants have their festivals, particularly around major holy days, Christmas, Easter, Midsummer. These involve dancing, drinking, games, temporary releases from the grinding labor of daily life. Nobles have their feasts and tournaments, elaborate displays of wealth and status. Minstrels and storytellers travel the roads, performing at noble courts and village celebrations, preserving and transmitting stories, both sacred and secular. Music is part of liturgy, the solemn Gregorian chant that fills churches and monasteries. Outside sacred contexts, there are secular songs, work songs, love songs, drinking songs, transmitted orally, changing with each singer. Instruments include pipes, drums, stringed instruments like the lute and vielle, organs in churches. This, then, is the texture of life within the Holy Roman Empire in its medieval flowering, diverse, complex, structured by hierarchies of status and power, yet offering spaces for agency and achievement. It is not the empire of grand narratives and dramatic events, but the empire of daily life, the countless small stories that together constitute the real substance of history, the lived experience of the millions whose names we will never know, but whose labor and lives made possible everything else. The crown of the Holy Roman Emperor was not a simple object, but a remarkable piece of craftsmanship, its 8 gold plates hinged together, adorned with precious stones and pearls, with enamel plaques depicting biblical scenes. It still exists, preserved in Vienna, a tangible link to the emperors who wore it. But the crown was more than gold and gems. It was a symbol of authority, of the complex and contested relationship between the empire, the church, and the various kingdoms and territories that made up medieval Europe. In the 11th and 12th centuries, the pattern of imperial succession became increasingly complicated. The title of Holy Roman Emperor involved multiple stages. First, a man would be elected King of the Romans by the German princes. Then, ideally, he would travel to Italy and be crowned King of Italy. Finally, he would proceed to Rome for coronation as emperor by the Pope. Each stage carried its own authority and its own challenges. The election of the King of the Romans was the prerogative of the German princes, initially all the major dukes, but eventually formalized into a specific group of 7 electors: the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. These 7 alone would have the right to elect the emperor, a constitutional arrangement that would last for centuries. But election did not guarantee power. Each new emperor had to negotiate with the German princes, confirming their privileges, settling disputes, often making concessions in return for their support. And once elected, the emperor had to contend with Italy, where his authority was always contested and often required military force to maintain. Conrad II, who became emperor in 1027, exemplified the challenges and opportunities of the imperial office. He was the first of the Salian dynasty, chosen to succeed the childless Henry II. Conrad was an effective ruler, strengthening royal authority in Germany and reasserting imperial control in Italy. He also annexed the kingdom of Burgundy to the empire, adding territory that included what is now eastern France and western Switzerland. His son, Henry III, proved even more capable. Henry ascended to the throne in 1039 and ruled until 1056, a reign marked by imperial power at its height. He intervened decisively in church affairs, deposing 3 rival popes in 1046 and ensuring the election of reforming popes who supported imperial authority. He ruled Germany firmly, crushed rebellions, extended imperial influence into Hungary and Bohemia. But Henry III's reign also contained the seeds of future conflict. The reform of the Church that he supported would eventually challenge imperial authority over ecclesiastical appointments, leading to the investiture controversy, one of the defining conflicts of the medieval period. Henry III died young in 1056, leaving a 6-year-old son, Henry IV, as his heir. The regency during Henry's minority allowed German nobles to recover much of the autonomy they had lost under Conrad and Henry III. When Henry IV came of age, he found himself ruling an empire where his authority was contested at every turn. The investiture controversy began in earnest during Henry IV's reign. At its core was a fundamental question: who had the authority to appoint bishops and abbots, the emperor or the pope? For centuries, emperors and kings throughout Europe had treated ecclesiastical positions as theirs to fill, investing bishops with the symbols of their office, the ring and staff. Bishops were not just spiritual leaders, but also temporal rulers, governing territories and commanding resources essential to royal power. Pope Gregory VII, elected in 1073, challenged this system. He insisted that only the Church could appoint churchmen. That lay investiture was simony, the sinful buying and selling of sacred office. He issued decrees forbidding lay investiture and declaring that the Pope had authority to depose emperors. Henry IV initially resisted, asserting his traditional rights. The conflict escalated quickly. In 1076, Gregory excommunicated Henry and declared him deposed. This was more than a spiritual penalty. It released Henry's subjects from their oaths of loyalty, threatening his rule in Germany, where rebellious nobles were quick to take advantage. Henry responded with one of the most famous episodes of medieval history. In January 1077, in the depths of winter, he crossed the Alps and came to Canossa in northern Italy, where Gregory was staying. There, according to tradition, Henry stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days, doing penance, begging the Pope's forgiveness. Gregory, who could not in Christian charity refuse a penitent sinner, absolved Henry and restored him to communion. Canossa has entered history as a symbol of papal supremacy over secular authority. But the reality was more complex. Gregory lifted the excommunication, but the political situation in Germany remained volatile. The German nobles had already elected an anti-king, Rudolf of Rheinfelden, and civil war consumed the empire for years. Gregory eventually excommunicated Henry again, and Henry responded by declaring Gregory deposed and supporting the election of an anti-pope, Clement III. The conflict continued for decades, beyond the deaths of both Gregory and Henry, becoming a struggle not just about investiture, but about the fundamental relationship between spiritual and temporal authority in Christian Europe. Eventually, a compromise was reached in the Concordat of Worms in 1122, which distinguished between the spiritual authority conveyed by the ring and staff, which the Church alone could grant, and the temporal authority over church lands, which the emperor could grant. It was a sophisticated solution that allowed both sides to claim victory while establishing clearer boundaries between church and state. But the investiture controversy had weakened imperial authority in Germany. The decades of civil conflict had strengthened regional nobles and fragmented the empire. When Henry IV's son, Henry V, died without heirs in 1125, the throne passed to Lothar II, and then to Conrad III of the Hohenstaufen family, beginning a new dynasty that would produce some of the most remarkable emperors in the empire's history. Frederick I, called Barbarossa for his red beard, became emperor in 1152 and ruled until 1190. He was perhaps the most significant emperor of the Middle Ages, a man who attempted to realize fully the imperial ideal, to make the empire a genuine political force rather than merely a prestigious title. Frederick understood power in pragmatic terms. In Germany, he worked with the princes rather than against them, confirming and even extending their rights in exchange for their support. He recognized that his realm was a confederation, that successful rule required consensus and negotiation. He established his own territorial base in Swabia and Franconia, lands directly under royal control, providing resources independent of the nobles. In Italy, Frederick was more aggressive. He made 6 expeditions into Italy, attempting to reassert imperial authority over the northern Italian cities, which had grown wealthy and independent. These cities, Milan, Genoa, Venice, Florence, others, were becoming powers in their own right, their economies based on trade and manufacturing rather than agriculture, their governance increasingly republican rather than monarchical. Frederick besieged Milan in 1162, captured it, and largely destroyed it as an example to other cities. But the Italian cities formed the Lombard League, allying against imperial authority, supported often by the Pope, who saw Frederick as a threat to papal independence. The conflict culminated in the Battle of Legnano in 1176, where Frederick's army was defeated by the Lombard League. It was a shocking loss, forcing Frederick to negotiate, ultimately recognizing substantial autonomy for the Italian cities while maintaining nominal imperial authority. Frederick's reign also coincided with the Third Crusade. In 1190, at nearly 70 years old, Frederick led a massive army overland toward the Holy Land, responding to the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin. But he never reached Jerusalem. Crossing a river in Anatolia, he fell from his horse and drowned. An anticlimactic end for a legendary emperor. His death threw the crusade into confusion, and without his leadership, the German contingent largely returned home. His son, Henry VI, inherited a powerful position. Through his wife, Constance, he claimed the Norman kingdom of Sicily, uniting for the first time the imperial territories in Germany and northern Italy with the wealthy kingdom of southern Italy and Sicily. But Henry died young in 1197, leaving a 3-year-old son, the future Frederick II. The next decades saw civil war in Germany between rival candidates for the throne, Hohenstaufen against Welf, with the Pope intervening on various sides as suited papal interests. Not until 1220 did Frederick II finally secure full recognition as emperor. Frederick II was perhaps the most remarkable ruler of the medieval period. Raised in Sicily, educated in both Christian and Islamic learning, fluent in multiple languages, he created a cosmopolitan court that was unique in Europe. He was a patron of science and art, a lawgiver who issued comprehensive legal codes, a skeptic who questioned religious orthodoxy while maintaining his position as Holy Roman Emperor. He spent little time in Germany, delegating authority there to his son and to the German princes. His focus was on Italy and Sicily, where he built a strong, centralized monarchy. He founded the University of Naples, reformed law and administration, promoted trade and culture. His court at Palermo was brilliant, attracting scholars and artists from across Europe and the Mediterranean. But Frederick was constantly in conflict with the papacy. Pope Gregory IX excommunicated him multiple times. Pope Innocent IV called a general council in Lyon in 1245 that declared Frederick deposed. Frederick responded by continuing to rule, treating papal declarations as irrelevant. The conflict between empire and papacy reached its most bitter point, becoming a struggle for supremacy in Italy and, symbolically, for the soul of Christian Europe. Frederick died in 1250, and with him died the last real possibility of a strong, centralized, Holy Roman Empire. His sons tried to maintain the inheritance, but they faced overwhelming opposition from the papacy and the Italian cities. By 1268, the last Hohenstaufen heir had been executed, and the direct Hohenstaufen line was extinct. What followed was the Great Interregnum, a period from 1254 to 1273, when the imperial throne was contested among various candidates, none strong enough to establish control. It was a period of imperial weakness, when Germany fragmented further and the Italian territories effectively became independent of imperial authority. In 1273, the German princes elected Rudolf of Habsburg, a relatively minor noble from what is now Switzerland, precisely because he was not powerful enough to threaten their autonomy. Rudolf proved more capable than expected, establishing his family in Austria and laying the foundation for what would eventually become the Great Habsburg dynasty. But the empire Rudolf ruled was very different from the empire of the Ottonians or the early Hohenstaufens. It was more clearly German, with Italy only nominally attached. It was more of a confederation, with real power residing in the territorial princes rather than the emperor. And it was no longer the paramount power in Europe. France, England, the Italian city-states, and the kingdoms of Spain were all rising as independent centers of power and culture. The crown remained, passed from emperor to emperor, symbol of an authority that was always more claimed than exercised, more potential than actual. But it continued to matter. To be Holy Roman Emperor was to claim a unique status, to be the secular head of Christendom, the heir to Augustus and Constantine and Charlemagne. Even when that claim bore little relation to political reality, it retained symbolic power, justifying actions, conferring legitimacy, connecting present rulers to the long history of Christian empire in the West. In quiet moments, in the treasuries where the crown was kept between coronations, sunlight would catch the gold and jewels, making them gleam in the darkness. It was beautiful, this object of power, crafted by artisans whose names are lost to history, worn by men who shaped their age and are remembered still. And it endures long after the empire itself has vanished, a reminder that even the grandest of human institutions are ultimately transient, that all crowns are eventually laid aside, that only the story remains. In the autumn rain of a November day in 1202, a papal legate stood before the gates of a monastery in Saxony, carrying letters sealed with the papal seal. Letters that would excommunicate nobles and interdict their lands if they did not yield to the Pope's judgment in a disputed election. Such scenes were repeated countless times across the Holy Roman Empire throughout the Middle Ages, evidence of the complex and often contentious relationship between the papacy and the empire. This relationship was paradoxical from the beginning. The Pope crowned the emperor, suggesting papal supremacy. But the emperor claimed to be the protector of the church, suggesting imperial authority over ecclesiastical matters. Both claimed to derive their authority from God. Both saw themselves as essential to Christian society, and both sought to define the other's proper role and limits. We have already seen how the investiture controversy of the 11th century brought these tensions to a crisis. But the resolution at Worms in 1122 settled only the specific question of lay investiture, not the broader issue of the relationship between the two powers. Throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, popes and emperors continued to struggle, sometimes in alliance, often in opposition, defining and redefining the boundaries of sacred and secular authority. The papal monarchy, as it developed through the 12th century, became increasingly sophisticated in its claims and its administration. Popes asserted not just spiritual authority over all Christians, but also temporal authority over the papal states and, in theory, supremacy over all Christian rulers as the vicar of Christ on earth. Papal government expanded dramatically. The papal curia became a complex bureaucracy, handling legal cases from throughout Christendom, issuing decrees on doctrine and discipline, appointing bishops and abbots, raising revenue through taxes and fees. Canon law, the law of the Church, developed into a comprehensive legal system, taught in universities comparable in sophistication to Roman civil law. The development of papal power was not simply about ambition or worldly concern, though those played their part. It was also rooted in a genuine belief that the Church needed independence from secular control to fulfill its spiritual mission. That reform required centralization, that the Pope, as successor to Peter, had unique authority and responsibility. Pope Innocent III, who reigned from 1198 to 1216, represented the apex of papal power. He was a lawyer by training, brilliant and energetic, absolutely convinced of papal supremacy. He intervened in the affairs of kingdoms throughout Europe, deposing and installing kings in Germany, England, and elsewhere, placing entire kingdoms under interdict when rulers defied papal authority. An interdict was a powerful weapon. It meant that in the affected territory, the sacraments could not be administered except to the dying. no masses, no marriages, no burials in consecrated ground. It created tremendous pressure on rulers from their own subjects, who feared for their souls and blamed their rulers for the Church's displeasure. Innocent III's reign coincided with the period of greatest disorder in Germany during the succession crisis following Henry VI's death. Innocent supported first one candidate, then another for the German throne, always seeking to weaken imperial power and maintain papal freedom of action in Italy. The conflict between Frederick II and the papacy, which dominated the mid-13th century, took on characteristics of total war, though fought more with words and laws than with armies. Frederick was excommunicated multiple times, his supporters placed under interdict, his legitimacy as emperor denied. Frederick, in turn, claimed the Pope had fallen into heresy, circulated letters questioning papal power, allied with anyone who opposed papal ambitions. The papacy preached crusades against Frederick, offering the same spiritual rewards for fighting the emperor as for fighting Muslims in the Holy Land. This was controversial even among those who supported the Pope, using the apparatus of crusade against a Christian ruler, even an excommunicated one, seemed to many to devalue the very concept of crusade and to make the papacy's spiritual authority serve political ends. The conflict was portrayed by both sides as a struggle between good and evil, between Christ and Antichrist. Papal propagandists depicted Frederick as the apocalyptic beast, the enemy of God's people. Frederick's supporters portrayed the Pope as the true Antichrist, corrupting the Church for worldly power. The rhetoric was extreme, but it reflected genuine conviction on both sides about the righteousness of their cause. The conflict was also about very practical concerns: control of territory in Italy, the distribution of revenue from church lands, the appointment of bishops and abbots, the administration of justice in matters that touched both secular and ecclesiastical interests. The papal states in central Italy separated the imperial territories in the north from the Kingdom of Sicily. Whoever controlled these territories controlled Italy, and control of Italy was essential to any emperor who sought to make imperial authority more than merely nominal. Throughout this period, the empire was also dealing with internal challenges. The German princes used conflicts between emperor and pope to enhance their own power, playing the two sides against each other, demanding concessions in return for their support. The result was a steady devolution of authority from the center to the territories, from emperor to princes. After Frederick II's death and the extinction of the Hohenstaufen line, the papacy might have seemed triumphant. It had defeated the greatest emperor of the age, eliminated a dynasty that had challenged papal supremacy for generations, and established, apparently, the principle of papal authority over secular rulers. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The conflict had damaged both institutions. The papacy had become deeply politicized, its spiritual authority tarnished by involvement in wars and dynastic struggles. The use of spiritual weapons, excommunication, interdict, crusade, for political purposes had made them less effective, less feared, less respected. Moreover, the rise of strong monarchies in France, England, and Spain meant that the papacy faced new challenges from rulers who could largely ignore papal claims to temporal supremacy. The conflict with Frederick had been the last time a pope could realistically claim authority over a major secular ruler. The symbolic low point came in 1303 when Pope Boniface VIII, who had made the most extreme claims of papal supremacy, was briefly captured and humiliated by agents of King Philip IV of France. Boniface died shortly after, and his successor moved the papal court to Avignon, where it remained for 70 years under the influence of the French kings. This period, called the Babylonian captivity of the papacy by its critics, represented a dramatic reversal of papal fortunes. But these events lay beyond the central period of empire-papacy conflict. For our purposes, what matters is understanding the nature of the relationship during its most intense period, from the investiture controversy through the fall of the Hohenstaufens. It was, at its core, a conflict about the proper ordering of Christian society. Both sides agreed that Christendom should be unified, that Christian society had a sacred purpose, that temporal and spiritual authority should work in harmony. They disagreed about the nature of that harmony, about which authority was supreme when they conflicted, about the boundaries between sacred and secular. The medieval solution was the doctrine of the two swords, based on a passage in the Gospel where Peter has two swords. This was interpreted to mean there were two forms of authority in Christian society: spiritual and temporal, church and state, pope and emperor. Both were necessary, both were ordained by God, and ideally they should support each other. But this left unanswered the question of what happened when they disagreed. Who had final authority? The papacy claimed that the spiritual was higher than the temporal, that the emperor held his sword from the pope, that papal authority could thus overrule imperial authority in the last resort. The empire claimed that both swords came directly from God, that the emperor was answerable only to God for his temporal rule, that the pope had no authority to depose an emperor. These were not merely abstract debates, they had real consequences for real people. When pope and emperor conflicted, bishops and abbots, nobles and knights, cities and peasants had to choose sides or try to navigate between them. Territories could be placed under interdict, excommunicated rulers could see their subjects released from oaths of loyalty, wars could be declared holy, dynasties could be destroyed. Yet through all the conflict, there remained a sense that both institutions were necessary, that neither could simply eliminate the other. The most passionate advocates of papal supremacy did not argue that the empire should be abolished, only that it should acknowledge papal authority. The most determined emperors did not seek to eliminate the papacy, only to reduce it to a spiritual role that would not interfere with imperial governance. And in many ways, the two institutions were interdependent. The Pope needed the emperor as a counterweight to local Italian nobles and as a source of protection. The emperor needed papal coronation to legitimize his title, needed the support of the church for governance and administration, needed the moral authority that came from ruling as a Christian monarch in harmony with the church. In local communities throughout the empire, the conflicts between pope and emperor might seem distant and largely irrelevant. The parish priest continued to say Mass. The local lord continued to collect his dues. The rhythm of the agricultural year continued unchanged. But the conflicts shaped the legal and political structures within which these lives were lived, determined who held power and on what basis, influenced everything from taxation to education to marriage law. Looking back from our distant vantage point, it is easy to see the conflict as a struggle for power between ambitious institutions. But for those involved, it was about truth and righteousness, about the proper ordering of the world, about faithfulness to God's plan for Christian society. They took these matters seriously, sometimes to the point of war, because they believed the stakes were ultimate. Not just political power, but the salvation of souls and the realization of God's kingdom on earth. And so the conflicts continued, generation after generation, pope against emperor, emperor against pope. Treaties made and broken, alliances formed and dissolved, the two great institutions of medieval Christendom, unable to coexist peacefully, yet unable to exist without each other, locked in a complex dance that would continue in various forms until the empire itself finally dissolved more than 5 centuries after the investiture controversy first brought their relationship to crisis. In the quiet of a cathedral at evening, as candles were lit and the last prayers of the day were chanted, the conflict between Pope and Emperor might have seemed irrelevant, a worldly concern far from the true business of worship and devotion. But the cathedral existed because of the institutional church, its bishop appointed through processes shaped by the outcomes of papal-imperial conflict, its lands and revenues structured by the compromises and agreements reached through centuries of struggle. Even here, in this moment of peace and prayer, history's weight was present, invisible but real, shaping everything. As the 13th century progressed, something new was stirring in the towns and cities scattered throughout the Holy Roman Empire, a vitality and independence that would gradually transform medieval society. While emperors and popes contested for supremacy, and while nobles fought their local wars, urban communities were developing their own sources of power, based not on land and warfare, but on trade and manufacturing, not on ancient privilege, but on created wealth. Venice, though technically part of the empire, was effectively independent, its magnificent basilica rising from the lagoon, its warehouses filled with goods from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Genoa and Pisa competed for dominance in Western Mediterranean trade. In the north, cities along the Rhine and in Flanders were growing wealthy from the cloth trade and from serving as entrepôts between northern and southern Europe. Within Germany itself, cities were achieving independence from their feudal overlords, becoming essentially self-governing communities. This happened gradually, through the grant or purchase of charters that specified the city's rights and privileges, through the simple fact that urban wealth gave cities leverage to demand concessions, through imperial policy that sometimes favored cities as counterweights to noble power. A typical imperial city in the 13th or 14th century would be surrounded by walls, its skyline dominated by churches and the towers of wealthy merchant families. Within the walls, the space was densely built. Buildings, often several stories high, sharing walls with their neighbors. The streets were narrow, unpaved, lined with shops on the ground floor and living quarters above. The city would be governed by a council drawn from the wealthier citizens, merchants, and master craftsmen who made laws, imposed taxes, dispensed justice, and negotiated with outside authorities. The city would have its own courts, its own militia, its own seal and symbols of sovereignty. It would owe allegiance to the emperor, and in return for this allegiance and certain taxes, it enjoyed protection and substantial autonomy. Life in such cities was structured by the guilds, associations of craftsmen and merchants that controlled their respective trades. To practice a craft, one had to be a guild member. The guilds set standards for quality, regulated prices and working conditions, limited competition, and provided support for members and their families in times of need. A young person entering a trade would typically serve an apprenticeship of several years, living with a master craftsman, learning the skills of the trade in exchange for labor and minimal payment. After completing the apprenticeship, they would become a journeyman, working for wages. Eventually, if successful, they might become a master themselves, able to train apprentices and vote in guild affairs. The guilds were more than just economic organizations. They were social communities with their own patron saints, their own festivals and processions, their own halls where members gathered. They provided a framework of identity and belonging for urban craftsmen, a source of pride and collective strength. The wealth of these cities came from various sources. The cloth trade was particularly important in the northern cities. Wool from England would be imported to Flanders, where skilled weavers and dyers would transform it into high-quality cloth that was then exported throughout Europe. The Hanseatic League, a confederation of northern German trading cities, dominated commerce in the Baltic and North Sea, trading in furs, timber, grain, fish, and manufactured goods. In the south, the Italian cities were gateways to the east, spices from Asia, silks from China, carpets from Persia, gold and ivory from Africa. All of these flowed through Venice and Genoa, carried by ship across the Mediterranean, then transported overland across the Alps to markets in Germany and beyond. Banking developed to facilitate this trade. The exchange of money, the extension of credit, the transfer of funds across long distances, these required expertise and capital. Italian banking families like the Medici, though they came later, pioneered techniques that became fundamental to modern finance. Bills of exchange allowed merchants to avoid transporting large amounts of coin, reducing the risk of robbery. Credit arrangements allowed merchants to finance expeditions and purchases, paying back from profits when goods were sold. The fairs of Champagne, held in several towns in what is now northeastern France, became major commercial events where merchants from throughout Europe would gather, exchange goods, settle accounts, negotiate contracts. The fairs were protected by special laws guaranteeing safe conduct to all merchants, allowing business to be conducted peacefully even in times of war. This commercial expansion was facilitated by several factors. Europe's population was growing, creating larger markets for goods. Agricultural improvements meant more people could be freed from food production to pursue other occupations. The relative peace within many regions allowed safer travel. The Church, despite its prohibition of usury, found ways to accommodate commercial activity, recognizing that trade served the common good. The physical appearance of cities reflected their wealth. Great churches and cathedrals were constructed, their scale and beauty testament to both religious devotion and urban prosperity. The cathedrals of Cologne, Strasbourg, and Ulm, though taking centuries to complete, represented communal efforts, funded by donations from all levels of society, but particularly from wealthy merchants seeking to express their piety and civic pride. Secular buildings, too, became more impressive. City halls, guild halls, and the houses of wealthy merchants were built of stone, with elaborate facades reflecting the growing confidence and self-consciousness of urban elites. The city itself became a work of art, its public spaces designed to impress and inspire, its fountains and monuments celebrating its history and importance. Universities were being founded in many cities, though most were not within the empire itself, but in France, Italy, and England. These institutions, however, attracted students from throughout Europe, including from imperial territories. Young men would travel to Paris or Bologna to study law, medicine, theology, or the arts, then return home carrying new ideas and knowledge. The intellectual life of the universities was vigorous and sometimes contentious. The rediscovery of Aristotle's works, transmitted through Arabic sources, created excitement and controversy. How to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology became a major preoccupation, leading to the great scholastic syntheses of Thomas Aquinas and others. Within the empire, the growth of cities created tension with traditional authorities. Nobles resented cities' independence and wealth, sometimes allying to attack and subjugate them. Bishops who had ruled cities as temporal lords found their authority challenged by urban communes demanding self-government. Emperors oscillated between supporting cities as allies against nobles and needing noble support against papal opposition. The result was a complex patchwork. Some cities achieved full independence as free imperial cities, answering only to the emperor. Others gained substantial autonomy while acknowledging a local lord. Still others remained firmly under episcopal or noble control. The political map of the empire became extraordinarily complicated, with territories of varying sizes and statuses interspersed in a pattern that would persist for centuries. Trade routes became strategic assets. Cities located at key points, river crossings, mountain passes, junctions of major roads, could grow wealthy from tolls and from serving the needs of travelers and merchants. Cities competed for trade, sometimes through honest commercial competition, sometimes through exclusive contracts or by physically blocking rival routes. The expansion of trade also meant increased contact with other cultures. German merchants in Venice encountered Byzantine and Muslim traders. They saw goods from places they had only heard of in travelers' tales. They heard different languages, observed different customs, were exposed to different ideas. This contact was not always welcome. There was suspicion and hostility, as well as curiosity. But it was real and consequential. Within cities, communities of foreign merchants established themselves. There would be quarters where Italians lived, where merchants from particular cities or regions congregated. These communities maintained their own customs, worshipped in their own way, often had their own legal privileges. They were evidence of how trade was creating networks that crossed political boundaries, binding Europe together through economic ties, even as it remained politically fragmented. Jewish communities were present in many cities, playing important roles in trade and finance. They lived under various degrees of protection and restriction, valued for their economic contributions, yet often resented and scapegoated during times of crisis. The empire's relationship with its Jewish subjects was complex, with emperors sometimes protecting them as imperial subjects, sometimes yielding to local pressures for expulsion or persecution. The Black Death, which struck Europe in the mid-14th century, would temporarily disrupt this commercial expansion, killing perhaps a third of the population and creating social and economic chaos. But the structures that had been built, the trade networks, the urban institutions, the commercial practices, would survive and eventually thrive again. By the late Middle Ages, the economic center of gravity in Europe had shifted noticeably northward and westward. Italy remained wealthy, but the Netherlands and the cities of the Rhine were increasingly important. England was developing its own commercial infrastructure. The Mediterranean, which had been the heart of European trade since Roman times, was becoming less central as Atlantic commerce grew. Within the empire, this meant growing differentiation between regions. The northern and western territories, more urbanized and commercialized, were developing differently from the eastern territories, which remained more rural and feudal. This would have political consequences, contributing to the difficulty of maintaining any real unity within the empire. But in the 13th and 14th centuries, as we are discussing, the future was not yet clear. What was clear was that a new form of power had emerged, based not on land or lineage, but on commerce and industry. A form of power that could rival nobles and eventually support territorial princes in their conflicts with each other and with the emperor. In the twilight of a summer evening, as workshops closed and merchants tallied their accounts, the city would settle into a different rhythm. Church bells called the faithful to evening prayers. Families gathered for their meals. In the taverns, apprentices and journeymen drank and socialized. The city gates would be closed and guarded through the night, protecting the community within from bandits and hostile forces without. And in the morning, the gates would open again, the markets would fill, the sound of hammers and looms and commerce would resume. The city was alive, dynamic, growing, a new form of community that would gradually transform medieval society, creating the foundations for the modern world that would eventually emerge from the medieval. Foundations laid stone by stone, transaction by transaction, generation by generation, in the bustling streets and counting houses of the empire's cities. In the quiet of a monastery cell on the evening of October 31st, 1517, a professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg in Saxony put the finishing touches on a document. It was a list of 95 theses, statements for academic debate about the practice of selling indulgences. The professor, Martin Luther, posted these theses on the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, as was customary for inviting scholarly discussion. He could not have imagined that this academic exercise would ignite a religious revolution that would split Western Christianity and transform the Holy Roman Empire forever. The Reformation was not, of course, the sudden product of one man's protest. It had roots stretching back generations in growing dissatisfaction with the Church's worldliness, in criticisms of corruption and abuses, in movements like the Hussites in Bohemia, who had earlier challenged papal authority. It arose in a context of changing technology, the printing press allowing rapid dissemination of ideas, and changing politics, princes seeking greater autonomy from both emperor and pope. But Luther's protest had a particular resonance. His 95 theses attacked the sale of indulgences, documents supposedly reducing time in purgatory for oneself or one's deceased relatives, sold by church officials to raise revenue. To Luther, this practice was theologically corrupt, suggesting that salvation could be bought rather than being a free gift of God's grace received through faith. The theses were quickly translated from Latin into German, printed and distributed throughout the empire. Within weeks, they were being read and discussed from Saxony to Switzerland, from the Rhine to Austria. Luther found himself at the center of a controversy that rapidly escalated beyond academic debate. The church authorities demanded Luther recant. He refused, arguing that he could not deny what Scripture and conscience told him was true. In 1520, Pope Leo X issued a bull threatening Luther with excommunication unless he recanted. Luther publicly burned the papal bull. In January 1521, he was formally excommunicated. The newly elected Emperor Charles V summoned Luther to appear before the imperial diet at Worms in April 1521. Charles V was a formidable figure, ruler not just of the empire, but also of Spain, the Netherlands, much of Italy, and vast territories in the New World. He was a devout Catholic, committed to maintaining the unity of Christendom. But he also needed the support of the German princes, many of whom were sympathetic to Luther, or at least saw advantage in his challenge to papal authority. At Worms, Luther was asked if he would recant his writings. His response became legendary. "Here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. Amen." It was a statement of conscience that resonated throughout Europe. The Diet declared Luther an outlaw, but Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony, secretly sheltered him in Wartburg Castle, where Luther spent nearly a year translating the New Testament into German, a work that would prove as influential as his theological writings. Luther's translation made Scripture accessible to ordinary Germans in their own language. Combined with the printing press, this meant that for the first time, laypeople could read the Bible themselves rather than depending on clergy to interpret it for them. This was revolutionary, undermining the Church's role as the necessary intermediary between the faithful and God's Word. Luther's theology emphasized salvation by grace through faith alone, rejecting the elaborate sacramental system and the authority of tradition and papal pronouncements. He reduced the sacraments from 7 to 2, baptism and the Eucharist as the only ones clearly commanded in Scripture. He rejected the special status of priests, arguing for the priesthood of all believers. He allowed clergy to marry, doing so himself in 1525. Other reformers emerged, some going further than Luther. In Zurich, Ulrich Zwingli established a reformed church separate from Rome. In Geneva, John Calvin developed a systematic theology that would prove even more influential than Luther's in some regions, emphasizing God's sovereignty and predestination. The radical Reformation went further still, with groups like the Anabaptists rejecting infant baptism, calling for adult baptism of believers only, advocating for complete separation of church and state, sometimes espousing apocalyptic beliefs. These groups were persecuted by Catholics and mainstream Protestants alike, seen as threatening the social order. The Reformation's spread was deeply political. Princes who converted to Protestantism gained control over church properties in their territories, vast wealth in lands and revenues. They could appoint their own bishops and clergy, eliminating papal influence in their domains. This appealed not just to sincere believers, but to rulers seeking greater autonomy and resources. Charles V opposed the Reformation vigorously. He saw it as heresy that must be suppressed, a threat to Christian unity and to imperial authority. But he was constantly distracted by other conflicts: wars with France, conflict with the papacy, the Ottoman threat to his eastern borders. The Ottomans had conquered Constantinople in 1453, and now their armies were pressing into Hungary, threatening Vienna itself in 1529. The Protestant princes organized for mutual defense, forming the Schmalkaldic League in 1531. They were supported by France, whose king, though Catholic, was willing to support German Protestants to weaken Charles V. The resulting military conflicts were inconclusive. Charles won significant victories, capturing the Protestant leaders in 1547, but he could not crush the movement entirely. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 established a compromise, cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm his religion. Each prince could determine whether his territory would be Catholic or Lutheran, and his subjects would have to conform or leave. This was not religious freedom as we understand it today, but it recognized the reality that the empire could not be reunited religiously by force. Charles V, exhausted and frustrated by his inability to maintain Catholic unity, abdicated in 1556, dividing his vast territories between his brother Ferdinand, who received the empire, and his son Philip, who received Spain and its possessions. Charles retired to a monastery in Spain, where he died 2 years later. The Peace of Augsburg did not end religious conflict. It excluded Calvinists and Anabaptists, recognizing only Catholicism and Lutheranism. It was inherently unstable, as conversion of a prince could theoretically change the religion of an entire territory, creating resentment and resistance. And it did nothing to heal the religious division. Catholics and Protestants each believed the other to be in error on matters essential to salvation. The following decades saw ongoing tension. The Catholic Counter-Reformation, spearheaded by the Jesuit order and formalized by the Council of Trent, worked to reform abuses, clarify doctrine, and win back territories lost to Protestantism. The Jesuits established schools and universities throughout the empire, providing education that combined intellectual rigor with firm Catholic orthodoxy. They became confessors to Catholic princes, influencing policy from positions of trust. Protestant territories developed their own educational systems, establishing universities and schools to train clergy and educate the faithful. Both sides recognized that education was key to maintaining their respective positions. Literacy rates rose, particularly in Protestant areas where reading the Bible was encouraged for all believers. The religious division of the empire was not clean or simple. Some territories were majority Protestant with Catholic rulers, or vice versa. Cities were often divided, with different neighborhoods following different confessions. Imperial institutions had to accommodate both religions, with representation for both Catholic and Protestant princes in the Diet and in imperial courts. The cultural impact of the Reformation was profound. Art and music changed. Protestant churches, particularly in Calvinist regions, stripped away images and decoration, creating austere spaces focused on preaching and scripture. Catholic churches responded with Baroque splendor, using art to inspire devotion and affirm Catholic teaching. Music flourished in both traditions. Luther encouraged congregational singing, producing hymns still sung today. The Catholic Church promoted elaborate polyphony, and later the Baroque splendor of composers like Bach, who, though Lutheran, drew on Catholic forms. Family life changed. The Protestant rejection of monasticism and promotion of clergy marriage elevated marriage and family as the normal Christian life. Women's roles were affected. They lost some opportunities available in convents, but gained status as wives and mothers in Protestant theology. Education expanded dramatically. Both Catholic and Protestant authorities wanted populations that could read, Catholics to be able to follow Catholic instruction, Protestants to be able to read the Bible. This drove expansion of schools and increase in literacy, with long-term consequences for European society. The empire itself was fundamentally changed. It became permanently divided religiously, making religious conflict an ongoing feature of imperial politics. The emperor's authority was further weakened as Protestant princes recognized no religious authority in the emperor beyond what they chose to grant him. The possibility of ever returning to the unified Christendom of earlier centuries was gone. Yet the empire persisted, adapting to accommodate religious diversity. The formula of Augsburg, however imperfect, allowed Catholics and Protestants to coexist within a single political framework, each side yielding territorial unity for the sake of peace, at least temporarily. In villages throughout the empire, the Reformation meant change at the most personal level. A family would wake one day to find their church stripped of its images, the Mass no longer said in Latin, the priest married with a family. Or they would resist these changes, clinging to the old ways, sometimes fleeing to territories where their faith was still practiced. For individuals, the choices were often agonizing. To change one's religion meant betraying what one had been taught from childhood, risking one's soul salvation. To refuse meant potentially losing property, position, even having to leave one's home. The Reformation was not just a theological or political event, but a human drama played out in countless individual lives, each person having to decide what they believed and what they would risk for those beliefs. In the twilight of the 16th century, as the generation that had known the unified church passed away, a new reality had established itself. The Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of Catholic and Protestant territories, its religious unity gone forever, its political coherence strained but not broken, its future uncertain. The fragmentation that had begun with the Carolingian division and the conflicts of the Middle Ages had reached a new level, not just political but spiritual, dividing not just territories but souls. And yet, remarkably, the empire continued. It would face its greatest crisis in the next century, a war that would dwarf all previous conflicts, nearly destroying the empire entirely. But that war, and the peace that would finally end it, lay ahead. The year 1618 began much like others in the early 17th century. The Peace of Augsburg had held, more or less, for 60 years. The empire remained divided between Catholic and Protestant territories, but violent conflict had been limited, contained by the recognition that neither side could simply crush the other. Then, on May 23rd, in Prague, capital of Bohemia, Protestant nobles threw 2 Catholic imperial governors and their secretary out of a window of Prague Castle, an act that would become known as the defenestration of Prague. The victims survived, falling some 70 feet into a pile of manure, but the incident became the spark for a war that would engulf the empire for 30 years, drawing in most of the major European powers, devastating much of Germany, and killing perhaps a third of the German population through violence, disease, and famine. Let us speak of this war gently, for its history is full of suffering. We will not dwell on atrocities or describe battles in detail, but we cannot ignore this great catastrophe that fundamentally changed the empire and the lands within it. The immediate cause was conflict in Bohemia. The largely Protestant Bohemian estates rejected the Catholic Ferdinand II as their king, choosing instead Frederick V, the Elector Palatine, a Calvinist prince. The Emperor Ferdinand II, recently elected, moved to crush this rebellion, seeing it as a challenge not just to his authority, but to the Catholic cause. Imperial forces, supported by the Catholic League of German princes, defeated the Bohemian rebels at the Battle of White Mountain in 1620. Frederick fled, earning the derisive nickname the Winter King for his brief reign. Ferdinand proceeded to re-Catholicize Bohemia by force, confiscating Protestant property, expelling Protestant ministers, and requiring conversion or exile. But the war did not end with Bohemia's subjugation. Protestant princes in the empire, particularly in northern Germany, saw Ferdinand's victory as a threat to themselves. Foreign powers intervened: Denmark, Sweden, France, each for their own reasons, transforming a German civil war into a European conflict. The Danish king, Christian IV, intervened to protect Protestant interests in northern Germany, but was defeated and forced to withdraw by 1629. The emperor appeared triumphant, his general Wallenstein having created a powerful imperial army. Ferdinand issued the Edict of Restitution, demanding return of all church properties secularized since 1552, essentially attempting to reverse 60 years of Protestant gains. This overreach alarmed even Catholic princes who valued their autonomy. It also prompted Swedish intervention. King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden entered the war in 1630, ostensibly to protect Protestantism, but also to secure Swedish interests in the Baltic. Gustavus was a military genius, a devout Lutheran, and an ambitious monarch. His intervention changed the war's character and balance. Swedish armies swept through northern Germany, winning decisive victories, pushing as far south as Bavaria. Gustavus died at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, but Swedish forces continued to operate in Germany for years, supported by French subsidies. France's involvement was particularly significant. Cardinal Richelieu, chief minister to King Louis XIII, was Catholic, but was willing to support Protestant forces to weaken the Habsburgs, who ruled both the Empire and Spain and surrounded France. French policy prioritized state interest over religious solidarity, a significant development in European politics. The war became increasingly destructive as it continued. Armies had to live off the land, taking food and supplies from local populations. Soldiers unpaid for months would plunder, pillage, and abuse civilians. Regions were occupied and reoccupied by different forces, each demanding contributions. Agricultural production collapsed in many areas as fields went unplanted or were trampled by armies. Disease spread, typhus, dysentery, bubonic plague, killing more than combat did. Contemporary accounts describe villages emptied, cities depopulated, wolves returning to areas where they had been unknown for generations. The suffering was immense and widespread. Some regions of Germany lost more than half their population. The scale of destruction was unprecedented in European history since the barbarian invasions. Peace negotiations began in Westphalia in 1644, but it took 4 years to reach agreement. The complexity of the negotiations reflected the complexity of the conflict. Dozens of parties, territorial disputes stretching back decades, religious issues, constitutional questions about the empire's structure. The Peace of Westphalia, signed in 1648, fundamentally restructured the empire. It recognized both Calvinism and Lutheranism alongside Catholicism, extending religious toleration beyond the Augsburg formula. It gave German princes virtual sovereignty in their territories, able to make their own foreign policy decisions, maintain their own armies. The emperor's authority was reduced to little more than titular. Territorially, Sweden gained lands on the Baltic coast. France gained territories in Alsace. Switzerland and the Netherlands, which had been nominally part of the empire, were formally recognized as independent. Hundreds of specific territorial adjustments within the empire were made, rewarding allies and punishing enemies. The settlement was remarkable in several ways. It accepted religious diversity as permanent, abandoning any hope of reuniting Christendom under one confession. It established principles of state sovereignty that would shape international relations for centuries. It created mechanisms for resolving disputes peacefully through negotiation rather than war. And it formalized the empire's transformation from a unified state to a loose confederation of effectively independent territories. The human cost of achieving this settlement had been terrible. Survivors returned to find their homes destroyed, their communities devastated, their world transformed. Recovery would take generations. Some regions didn't regain their pre-war population until the 19th century. Yet life did gradually return. Fields were replanted, villages rebuilt, families reconstituted from survivors. The patterns of daily life reasserted themselves, ploughing and planting, harvest and winter, birth and death, the eternal cycle continuing despite catastrophe. The war also had cultural impacts. The German language and culture had been set back, while French language and culture gained prestige and influence that would dominate Europe for the next century. The war had demonstrated the destructive potential of religious conflict, leading to growing sentiment that perhaps religious matters should be separated from political ones, contributing to the gradual secularization of European political thought. The empire that emerged from the Peace of Westphalia was a shadow of what the Ottos or the Hohenstaufens had ruled. The emperor was now elected by the same 7 electors, but had minimal power to compel obedience or raise revenues or armies. The territorial princes were the real powers, some ruling territories comparable to significant European states, others tiny jurisdictions barely larger than a manor. The Diet became primarily a forum for negotiation among sovereign princes, rather than a legislature for a unified state. The imperial courts continued to function, providing legal frameworks and dispute resolution, but their authority depended on voluntary compliance. The empire was held together more by tradition and mutual advantage than by any effective central authority. In villages and towns, in castles and monasteries, people rebuilt what had been destroyed and remembered what had been lost. Stories of the war would be passed down for generations, tales of heroism and horror, of survival against odds, of the time when armies swept back and forth across the land, bringing death and destruction. In quiet moments, perhaps sitting by a fire on a winter evening, an old person might tell a child about how things had been before the war, about relatives who had died, about the old church that had been burned, about the years of hunger and fear. And the child would listen, absorbing these stories, carrying them forward into a future that was slowly, gradual rebuilding from the ruins. The 30 Years' War was in many ways the end of the medieval Holy Roman Empire and the beginning of the modern system of European states. The idea of a unified Christian empire had not survived. In its place was something more pragmatic, more secular, more focused on power and interest than on religious or imperial ideals. Yet the empire itself persisted, its institutions continuing to function, its territories still acknowledging at least nominal allegiance to the emperor. It would continue for another century and a half, increasingly anachronistic, but providing a framework that perhaps prevented even worse fragmentation and conflict. Sometimes the achievement of an institution is not in what it accomplishes, but in the chaos it prevents, the structure it maintains, the worst outcomes it forestalls simply by continuing to exist. In the halls of Vienna, where the Habsburg emperors made their residence, life continued with Baroque splendor through the 17th and 18th centuries. There were balls and operas, elaborate court ceremonies, marriages that linked the Habsburgs to every royal house in Europe. But the magnificence of the court could not disguise the reality that the Holy Roman Empire, as a political institution, was steadily declining into irrelevance. After the Peace of Westphalia, the emperor's authority over the German princes was minimal. In theory, he was the supreme secular authority in the empire. In practice, he could neither command armies from the princes, nor raise significant taxes, nor make laws they were bound to obey. The empire was, in Voltaire's famous quip from 1756, neither holy nor Roman, nor an empire. And yet it persisted. The institutions continued to function. The imperial diet met, though increasingly it was a permanent congress rather than an occasional assembly, its delegates representing princes who rarely attended in person. The imperial chamber court and the Aulic Council continued to adjudicate disputes between princes and between princes and their subjects. The empire provided a legal framework, a set of procedures for resolving conflicts peacefully. A nominal unity that perhaps prevented worse fragmentation. The Habsburg emperors, though they could not effectively rule the empire as a whole, were powerful territorial princes in their own right. Their hereditary lands, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, territories in Italy and the Low Countries, made them one of the great powers of Europe. They focused increasingly on these hereditary lands, treating the imperial title as adding prestige and certain legal advantages, but not attempting to use it to extend their power over the other German territories. The other major German power was Brandenburg Prussia, a state constructed over several generations by the Hohenzollern dynasty. From modest beginnings as Margrave of Brandenburg and Duke of Prussia, the Hohenzollerns built through marriage, conquest, and shrewd diplomacy a state that by the 18th century could rival Austria. Under Frederick William I, and especially Frederick II, Frederick the Great, Prussia developed a formidable army and an efficient bureaucracy, becoming a kingdom in 1701. The rivalry between Austria and Prussia would dominate German affairs through the 18th century. When Emperor Charles VI died in 1740 without a male heir, he was succeeded by his daughter, Maria Theresa. Frederick II of Prussia used this opportunity to seize Silesia, a wealthy Austrian province, triggering the War of Austrian Succession. Maria Theresa was unable to recover Silesia despite years of war, and Prussia's retention of this territory confirmed its status as a great power. Maria Theresa's husband, Francis I, was elected emperor, continuing the Habsburg monopoly on the imperial title. But everyone understood that real power lay in the territorial states, not in the imperial office. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, saw Austria and Prussia as primary antagonists, with France, Russia, and other powers choosing sides based on their interests. The war was fought across Europe and in colonial territories worldwide, but its German aspects were fundamentally about the balance of power between the two major German states. The smaller German states navigated carefully between Austria and Prussia, seeking to maintain their autonomy while benefiting from the protection and patronage of one or the other major power. Some states like Saxony, Bavaria, and Hanover were significant powers themselves, able to play Austria and Prussia against each other. Hanover was particularly notable as its elector was also King of Great Britain from 1714 onward, linking British and imperial politics in complex ways. The empire's military structure had never recovered from the 30 Years' War. The imperial army, when one could be assembled, was a collection of contingents provided by various princes, often ill-coordinated and poorly supplied. The empire's response to external threats depended on whether the threatened territories happened to coincide with Habsburg interests. When the Ottoman Empire laid siege to Vienna in 1683, it was primarily Habsburg forces, aided by Polish King Jan III Sobieski, who lifted the siege, not an imperial army as such. The subsequent reconquest of Hungary from the Ottomans was a Habsburg rather than imperial achievement, though it was celebrated as a victory for Christendom. The Habsburg territories expanded significantly, incorporating all of Hungary and territories in the Balkans, but these were added to the Habsburg domains, not to the empire proper. Culturally, the 18th century was a period of remarkable achievement in German lands. This was the age of Bach and Handel, of Leibniz and Kant, of Goethe and Schiller. German universities were centers of learning, contributing to the Enlightenment's spread. German craftsmen and artists created works of lasting beauty. The Baroque gave way to Rococo and then to Neoclassicism, each style producing masterpieces. But this cultural flowering was tied to individual states and courts, not to the empire as a whole. Bavaria developed its own distinctive culture under the Wittelsbach dukes. Saxony, under its electors, who were also kings of Poland, built Dresden into a magnificent city. Prussia under Frederick the Great attracted French thinkers and built Berlin into a capital of enlightened absolutism. The ideal of enlightened absolutism, the idea that rulers should govern according to reason, promoting their subjects' welfare, reforming outdated institutions, was embraced to varying degrees by German princes. Frederick the Great corresponded with Voltaire, abolished torture, improved legal codes, promoted education and economic development. Maria Theresa and her son, Joseph II, reformed administration in Habsburg lands, improved the condition of peasants, promoted religious toleration, though not without limits. But these reforms were undertaken by individual rulers in their own territories, not by or through the empire. The empire as an institution was barely capable of reform, its structures locked in place by the competing interests of hundreds of princes and free cities, each jealous of their prerogatives. The French Revolution, beginning in 1789, would prove catastrophic for the empire. Revolutionary France's expansion threatened the German states directly. The French conquered the Rhineland, annexed territories, reorganized others into satellite states. Traditional powers were helpless before French military might under Napoleon Bonaparte. The individual German states responded in different ways. Some fought France and were defeated, others allied with France, hoping to gain territory or at least avoid conquest. The empire as an institution was paralyzed, unable to mount effective resistance. The old order was crumbling, and nothing the empire could do would stop it. Through all this decline, ordinary life continued in the villages and towns of the empire. Farmers plowed and planted, craftsmen practiced their trades, merchants conducted their business. The harvest still determined prosperity or hardship. The changing seasons still structured the year. The church bells still called the faithful to worship. For most people, the empire was a distant abstraction. What mattered was the local lord, the local pastor or priest, the local market and its prices. Whether their prince answered to an emperor in Vienna made little difference to their daily existence. The great affairs of state touched them only when armies marched through, requisitioning supplies and demanding quarters, or when taxes were raised to pay for wars they barely understood. The Enlightenment's ideas of reason and progress, of rational reform and human improvement were percolating through educated society, creating expectations of change and improvement. But these ideas were disconnected from the empire's obsolete structures. Reform would come through the individual states, if it came at all, or through the revolutionary upheavals that were beginning to shake Europe. In Vienna, the court continued its elaborate rituals, its balls and ceremonies, maintaining forms that had persisted for generations. The Habsburgs still claimed the imperial title, still went through the motions of election and coronation. But the substance had long since drained away, leaving only ceremony and tradition, beautiful perhaps, but ultimately empty of real power or purpose. The empire had become anachronistic, a relic of a medieval past in an increasingly modern world. Its survival into the dawn of the 19th century was less a testament to its strength than to the fact that no one had bothered to formally dissolve it. It persisted through inertia, through the absence of any clear alternative, through the vested interests of the many minor princes whose status depended on imperial institutions. But history was moving, preparing to sweep away this remnant of the Middle Ages, to replace it with something new that better fit the nationalism and state-building of the modern era. The Holy Roman Empire was living on borrowed time, and its time was almost up. In the quiet of a late summer evening in some small German town, as the sun set and the day's work ended, people might have gathered in the market square or at an inn, talking of local matters, perhaps occasionally discussing the news from Vienna or Paris, wondering what the future would bring. They could not know that their world was about to change fundamentally, that the political order that had existed for 1,000 years was about to disappear. But they could perhaps sense that something was ending, that an old order was passing away. And in that twilight, between the day that was ending and the uncertain night to come, the Holy Roman Empire continued its existence, maintained its forms, preserved its traditions, serving no longer as a real power, but as a memory, a ghost, a lingering presence of a different age. The summer of 1806 was warm in Central Europe, the kind of summer where the heat rises from cobblestones and lingers in stone buildings built centuries before. In the cities and towns of the Holy Roman Empire, life continued much as it had for generations. Markets operated, churches held services, administrative business was conducted. But across the Rhine, in France, decisions were being made that would finally end an institution that had survived for more than 800 years since its revival by Otto the Great. Napoleon Bonaparte, having crowned himself Emperor of the French 2 years earlier, had decisively defeated Austria and Russia at the Battle of Austerlitz in December 1805. The Treaty of Pressburg that followed forced Austria to cede territories and recognize Napoleon's reorganization of German lands. Napoleon had already begun this reorganization, creating the Confederation of the Rhine, a grouping of German states under French protection, allied to France and explicitly outside the Holy Roman Empire. The Confederation initially included 16 states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and others, but would eventually grow to include nearly all the German states, except Austria, Prussia, and a few northern territories. These states withdrew their allegiance from the Holy Roman Empire, leaving it a hollow shell. On July 12, 1806, representatives of these German princes formally announced their withdrawal from the empire and their entry into the Confederation of the Rhine. They declared that the Holy Roman Empire had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, and that they no longer recognized its institutions or the emperor's authority over their territories. Francis II, Holy Roman Emperor and Archduke of Austria, faced an impossible situation. The empire he nominally ruled had dissolved around him. The majority of its member states had withdrawn. The imperial institutions could no longer function. Napoleon had made clear that he considered the Holy Roman Empire defunct and that he would brook no rival to his own imperial title in Europe. On August 6, 1806, Francis II issued a declaration dissolving the Holy Roman Empire. He renounced the imperial crown, released all imperial estates and officials from their obligations to the empire, and declared that he could no longer fulfill the duties of the imperial office. He retained his other titles, particularly Emperor of Austria, a title he had created for himself in 1804 in anticipation of this moment. But the Holy Roman Empire was finished. There was no great ceremony, no dramatic confrontation, no final battle. The empire simply ceased to exist, dissolved by decree, its end as undramatic as the death of any ancient institution that has outlived its function and persists only through habit and legal fiction. The dissolution was met with remarkably little resistance or protest. The German princes who had withdrawn to join the Confederation of the Rhine were satisfied with arrangements that confirmed their sovereignty and rewarded them with territory and elevated status. Bavaria and Württemberg became kingdoms, Baden and Hesse-Darmstadt became grand duchies. The common people, for whom the empire had been a distant abstraction, barely noticed its passing. Life continued, governed now by territorial princes who answered to Napoleon rather than to an emperor in Vienna. In a sense, the Holy Roman Empire's end had been inevitable for more than a century. The Peace of Westphalia had reduced the emperor's authority to almost nothing. The rise of powerful territorial states, particularly Austria and Prussia, had made the empire increasingly irrelevant to the real distribution of power in German lands. The French Revolution and Napoleon's conquests simply delivered the final blow to an institution that had long since ceased to function as a meaningful political entity. And yet, for all its impotence in its final centuries, the Holy Roman Empire had been significant. It had provided a framework for political organization in Central Europe for more than 800 years. It had maintained a system of law and courts that offered some protection against arbitrary power. It had preserved some memory and ideal of unity among the German-speaking peoples, even as it failed to achieve real unity. Its institutions, however weak, had provided mechanisms for resolving disputes peacefully and maintaining some order in a region that might otherwise have fragmented completely into warring states. The empire's legacy would persist in complex ways. German nationalism in the 19th century would draw on memories of the Holy Roman Empire as representing a time when German lands were united, however loosely. The complex territorial divisions of the empire would shape German political geography long after the empire's end, contributing to the difficulty of achieving German unification in the 19th century. The Habsburg dynasty, having lost the imperial title, continued to rule a multi-ethnic empire centered on Austria, Hungary, and Bohemia. This Austrian Empire, and later Austria-Hungary, would endure until World War I, in some ways a successor to the Holy Roman Empire in its diversity and complexity, if not in its claims or structure. The German states that had been part of the empire eventually united under Prussian leadership to form the German Empire in 1871. A very different entity from the Holy Roman Empire, more centralized, more nationalistic, more militaristic, but one that still drew on certain traditions and memories from the earlier empire. In the villages and towns that had been part of the Holy Roman Empire, the change of sovereignty was noted, adjustments were made, and life went on. The same fields were ploughed, the same churches held services, the same festivals marked the year. Political structures changed, but the deeper continuities of culture and society persisted. The physical remnants of the empire endured. The churches and cathedrals built over centuries, the castles and palaces, the town halls and guild houses, the roads and bridges, the artwork and manuscripts. These continued to exist, testimony to the empire that had been, even as that empire itself passed into history. In the archives, documents accumulated over centuries remained, recording the business of the imperial courts and chanceries, the endless negotiations and treaties and legal proceedings that had been the substance of the empire's later existence. These documents would eventually become sources for historians seeking to understand this long-lived but ultimately failed attempt to maintain political unity in the heart of Europe. The imperial crown, that beautiful object of gold and jewels that had been placed on the heads of emperors from Otto the Great to Francis II, was preserved in Vienna, along with the other imperial regalia. No longer used, no longer having purpose, these objects became museum pieces, beautiful and historical, but no longer active symbols of power. And what of the ideal that the empire represented? The notion of a universal Christian empire in the West, a secular counterpart to the spiritual authority of the Church, a political manifestation of Christendom's unity. This ideal had perhaps never been fully realized, even at the empire's height. The unity had always been more aspiration than reality, the authority more claimed than exercised, the universalism contradicted by the particularity of German domination and the exclusion or loss of other European territories. Yet the ideal had mattered. It had shaped political thought, influenced behavior, provided a reference point against which reality could be measured. The notion that authority should be legitimate, that power should serve justice, that Christian rulers had obligations to their subjects and to God. These ideas, promoted and partly embodied by the empire, had consequences that outlasted the institution itself. In a monastery library somewhere in the former empire, monks continued to copy manuscripts and maintain records, as they had done for centuries. The empire that had often patronized and protected monasteries was gone, but the monastic life continued, its rhythms unchanged. The hours were still chanted, the liturgy still celebrated, the work still done. Some things persisted, while others passed away. As the 19th century progressed, Romanticism would rediscover the medieval period, idealizing it in ways that bore little relation to historical reality. The Holy Roman Empire would become part of this romantic vision, depicted as a golden age of chivalry and faith, of heroic emperors and noble knights, conveniently forgetting the violence and chaos, the failures and compromises, the gap between ideal and reality. But for those who had lived through the empire's final years, there was less romance and more simple acceptance. An old order had passed away. A new order was being born. They could not know what the new order would bring. The wars and revolutions, the nationalism and industrialization, the unprecedented changes that the 19th and 20th centuries would witness. They only knew that something that had been part of the landscape of their world for as long as anyone could remember was now gone. And perhaps some felt a sadness at its passing, not for any particular love of the empire or nostalgia for its rule, but simply for the passing of anything old and familiar. The inevitable melancholy that comes when we realize that time moves forward and does not return, that what was once essential eventually becomes unnecessary, that all human institutions, no matter how grand or long-lasting, are ultimately temporary. The Holy Roman Empire had lasted more than 800 years from Otto the Great's coronation to its dissolution, longer if we count from Charlemagne. It had survived invasions and wars, religious schisms and social upheavals, the Black Death and the Reformation. It had adapted to changing circumstances, modified its structures, persisted through periods of weakness and chaos. But in the end, it could not adapt to the modern world of nation-states and nationalism, of centralized bureaucratic power and mass conscript armies, of revolution and empire in the Napoleonic model. It had become anachronistic. And once something becomes anachronistic, its survival is merely a matter of when, not whether, it will disappear. And so it ended, not with battles or drama, but with a decree and a document, with signatures and seals, with formal renunciation of a title and dissolution of an institution. The Holy Roman Empire passed into history, remembered variously as a glorious achievement, or a failed ideal, or an obstacle to progress, or simply as one among many attempts to organize political life in complex times. Its story, like all stories, has an end. But the consequences of its existence, the patterns it established, the memories it left, these continued, woven into the fabric of European history, influencing what came after in ways both obvious and subtle, a ghost that haunted the future even as it receded into the past. The empire had been many things to many people across the centuries, a source of order and stability, an oppressor, a protector of the church, a competitor with the church, a unifying ideal, a collection of feuding territories, a successor to Rome, a distinctly Germanic realm. It had contained multitudes, contradictions, complexities. Now it was memory, and memory is always selective, always shaped by those who remember and their purposes in remembering. But memory is not nothing. The Holy Roman Empire would live on in memory, in the stories passed down, in the buildings it left behind, in the structures and patterns and ideas that outlasted the institution itself. Time flows like a river, carrying everything forward, and we who live in the present are constantly moving away from the past, leaving it behind. But the past does not disappear. It remains, changed by distance and perspective, but real nonetheless, part of the story that brought us to where we are, part of the foundation on which the present is built. And so we remember the Holy Roman Empire, not with fanfare or celebration, but quietly, thoughtfully, recognizing it as part of our shared past, one chapter in the long story of human attempts to build order from chaos, to create meaning from confusion, to establish something that might endure even as we know that all earthly things are temporary, that all empires fall, that only the river of time flows on, carrying our stories with it into the future, where they become part of the inheritance of those who come after us, as the stories of those who came before have become part of ours.